The surrender clock had already been running for 6 hours when the answer came back, and it was laughter. Registrar Vailoth of the Sale Concordance stood at the reception lectern of the listening station Ossuar 9 and watched the transcription engine try and fail to make sense of the sound. The engine was old and patient and had processed the capitulations of 911 civilizations. It knew the grammar of every surrender ever spoken. It knew the pleading tenses, the negotiating cadences. The small proud lies a dying species told itself in its final hour. It did not know what to do with laughter, so it printed the waveform raw, a jagged silver line spooling out across the glass, and beneath it in the cautious script of a machine unwilling to commit the notation, vocalization, en linguistic, unresolved. "Play it again," Vailoth said. The sound filled the chamber a second time. It was not one voice. It was many, layered, easy, and there was no fear anywhere in it. Somewhere under the laughter, a single human voice said something, a short phrase, and the transcription engine caught that at least and rendered it in the flat gray letters of translated speech. "We accept," it read, and then, after a pause, the engine measured at 1.4 seconds, "Now come and collect." Vailoth had delivered the session ultimatum to 4 species in his long service, and he had watched the recordings of hundreds more. He knew the shape of the moment intimately, the way a physician knows the shape of a wound. The ultimatum was not cruelty. That was the first thing the young registrars were taught, and the thing the absorbed peoples never understood until much later, if they lived to understand it at all. The session was mercy rendered as arithmetic. The concordance did not conquer. It enumerated. It arrived at the edge of a system. It transmitted the accounting of its own strength. The ship counts, the weapon yields, the historical record of every world that had refused and every world that had complied, and it offered the only rational choice. Submit and be catalogued. Be added to the ledger. Keep your cities, your children, your small local gods, and simply cease to be sovereign. The alternative was written into the same transmission, in the same dry font, and it was not a threat because a threat implies a possibility of failure. It was a forecast. 911 times, the forecast it held. The species that received the session did the arithmetic. They saw the numbers. Overwhelming numbers were the whole architecture of the concordance, the foundation and the roof of it. A single enumerated legion carried 11,000 vessels, and the concordance fielded 81 legions, and behind the legion stood the grand enumeration, and behind the grand enumeration stood 5,000 years of nobody ever having been foolish enough to make them count all the way to the end. The math was not survivable. Every species that had ever looked at the math had understood that it was not survivable. And so they wept, and they raged in private, and then they signed, because the concordance offered them the one thing a doomed people cannot refuse: continuation. Diminished, owned, entered into a book, but continuation. Earth had looked at the same math. And Earth had laughed. "The transmission is authenticated?" Vailoth asked. He did not turn from the glass. Behind him, the station's assessment cohort had gone very still in the way of Sale, who did not want to be the one to speak. "Fully," said the analyst at the primary array. Her name was Saresh. She was young for the posting, 3 sessions of experience, no more. Origin confirmed. Sol system, third body. The vocalization originates from a surface installation and a low-orbit platform simultaneously. We are registrar. We are reading a great many separate sources. The laughter is not a broadcast from one point. It is being contributed to. Contributed to. Yes, registrar, multiple population centers. The signal is aggregated. It appears to be deliberate, coordinated. Saresh hesitated. It appears that they organized it. Vailoth let that sit inside him. He was old enough that very little reached the deep places anymore, but this reached. Not the defiance itself. Defiance was common enough in the first hour, before the arithmetic did its work. What reached him was the coordination. A frightened species screamed in 1,000 uncoordinated directions. This species had gathered its voices, tuned them, and returned to the concordance an answer built the way one builds a wall. There was engineering in it. There was a decision behind it, made calmly, by a great many people at once. He had been doing this a long time. He knew what a decision made calmly by a great many people at once could become. Their military disposition, he said, the pre-session survey. Saresh brought it to the glass. The survey scrolled up beside the silver waveform of the laughter, and Veloth read it the way he had read 911 others. And for the first time in a very long career, the reading gave him no comfort. The survey was thin. That was the first wrongness. The Concordance's forward assessors had spent 2 of Earth's years mapping the Sol system before the session was authorized, and 2 years should have produced a document as thick as a man's arm. Instead, the file was slender and full of the small, careful notations that assessors used when they meant "I am uncertain and I do not wish to be blamed for it later." Population, estimated wide margins. Industrial output, estimated wider margins still. Fleet strength. The assessors had counted 4,100 hulls of military character in the Sol system and its near approaches, which was not nothing, which was in fact a respectable local navy for a single system people. And against a single enumerated legion, it was the strength of a candle held up against the coming of morning. 4,100 against 11,000, and the 11,000 were only the fraction of the concordance that had bothered to come. It should have been the easiest arithmetic in the survey, and yet the assessors had appended a notation to the fleet count, and the notation was the thing that had begun, very quietly, to trouble Veloth in the 6 hours since the ultimatum went out. It read, "Hull count probably incomplete. Several classes observed in transit were not observed in port. Origin and berthing of these classes undetermined. Recommend the count be treated as a floor and not a ceiling. Vessels observed moving that were never observed resting. Ships with no home in the survey. Ships that the Concordance's forward eyes had glimpsed crossing the dark and had never been able to catalog, because to catalog a thing you must find where it lives, and these did not appear to live anywhere the assessors could see. A floor and not a ceiling. Registrar," Saresh's voice had changed. "The human installation is transmitting again. Text this time, directed, its address to the station, to us." "Read it." She read it. And the assessment cohort, 40 sail who had between them supervised the peaceful absorption of dozens of worlds, listened to the words of a species that had just been shown the whole weight of the concordance, and had decided the weight was not enough. "To the accountants," Saresh read, "we received your numbers, we have checked them. You have made one error, and it is the only error that has ever mattered. You believe that we are being offered a choice between dying and submitting. You have not understood us at all. To us, those have always been the same word." She stopped. "There's more," she said. "There is always more," Veloth said quietly. "Read it. You call your arrival the session. You believe you have come to take our sovereignty. But sovereignty is not the thing you think it is, and it is not on the table, and it never was. What is on the table now is much smaller and much older. It is a very simple question that our kind has asked and answered on our own soil for longer than your ledger has existed. The question is what a people is willing to do to the thing that comes to make them kneel. And our answer, accountant, has never once changed. So here it is plainly, so that it may be entered accurately into your book. You ordered us to surrender. We decline. And in declining, we are not defending ourselves. Understand that. We are not raising a wall to keep you out. We have taken a different decision at every window and hearth and gathered voice on this world, and the decision is this: we are declaring our final war. Not a war to hold you off, a war to finish. It has one condition of ending, and the condition is not our survival. Come and collect. Bring all of it. You will need all of it, and it will not be enough." The chamber was silent. The transcription engine, having nothing to laugh at now, printed the human words in clean gray letters and, finding them grammatical, offered no notation at all. Veloth stood a long moment with his 4 hands folded. A war to finish, not a war to survive. He turned the phrase over and found beneath its bravado a thing that did not read as bravado. Bravado wanted to live. Bravado bargained even as it boasted. This did not bargain. It had removed its own survival from the equation as a preliminary step, the way one removes a variable that only complicates the solving, and having removed it, it had gone very cold and very clear. He had processed the surrenders of 911 civilizations, and he understood in that moment that he had never once, in all that long accounting, spoken to a people who had already decided to die. The species he absorbed always wanted to live. That wanting was the lever the session pulled. That wanting was the whole machine. Earth did not appear to want to live more than it wanted the concordance to end. You could not pull a lever that was not there. Compose the notification to the legionary command, Veloth said. His voice was steady. He had a duty, and the duty was clear, whatever unease moved in the deep places. Attach the full exchange. Attach the assessor's notation regarding the uncatalogued hulls. Recommend, he paused. The recommendation that protocol required was a single word, and it had been the correct word 911 times. Recommend the session proceed to enforcement. 1 Legion. Standard correction. Note my assessment that the target's defiance is genuine and organized, not performative, and that the survey of its fleet strength should be treated as incomplete. 1 Legion, Registrar, Saresh asked. It was not insubordination. It was the question of someone who had heard the words a war to finish and found that they lingered. 1 Legion is 11,000 vessels, Veloth said, against a single system that fields 4,000 at the most generous count. The arithmetic is not close, Saresh. The arithmetic has never once been close. He looked at the silver waveform of the laughter, still frozen on the glass. That is not what troubles me. Then what troubles you, Registrar? He was quiet for a moment. That they know the arithmetic too, he said. They ran it. They said so. We have checked them. They looked at 11,000 against 4,000, and at 80 more legions behind the first, and at the grand enumeration behind those, and it did not move them the width of a hair. Every species that ever laughed at the session stopped laughing when we showed them the count. This one laughed after. He turned from the glass at last. A people who is not frightened by a true accounting of overwhelming force is telling you something, Saresh. It is telling you that it possesses a variable you have not entered into your book, and the assessors have already found the edge of it. Hulls with no berth. A count that is a floor and not a ceiling. You think the survey missed a fleet. I think, Veloth said, that a species does not decide, calmly in coordinated millions, to wage a war whose only condition of ending is the end of an empire, unless it has good reason to believe it can pay the invoice it is writing. He folded his hands again. Send the notification. And append 1 line under my seal, above the recommendation. What line, Registrar? Veloth considered the words a long time before he gave them, because he knew they would be read at the command, and read by the young officers who kept the histories, and that if he was wrong they would be the small, foolish epitaph of a cautious old registrar who had frightened himself over laughter. He gave them anyway. The ledger has 911 entries, he said. Every one of them is a people who chose to live. We have never once written down what happens when a people chooses otherwise. I do not believe we are about to write down a surrender. I believe we are about to learn a new word. Saresh entered it. The notification went out on the long channels to the legionary command, carrying the laughter and the declaration and the thin frightened survey and the old registrar's warning, and it was received, and it was read, and the officers who read it were not frightened, because they had 11,000 ships and 5,000 years, and the whole weight of the arithmetic, and because none of them had stood in the chamber and heard the laughter come back with no fear anywhere in it. The 9th enumerated legion was ordered to Saul. It was a formality. Every officer aboard those 11,000 hulls understood it to be a formality. They had performed the correction before, the rare times a young species needed to be shown the difference between defiance and consequence, and the correction was always the same. The Legion arrived, it burned whatever fleet the locals had scraped together, it took up station over the homeworld, and it waited patiently, calmly, for the wanting to live to reassert itself as it always did, as it had always done. A week, a month, never longer. The session clock reset, and the people signed, and the ledger gained an entry, and the concordance moved on. The 9th Legion made the crossing to Sol in 19 days. Veloth followed its progress from Ossuarnine on the long channels, and he told himself that his unease was the unease of an old man too long at a lonely posting, and he almost believed it. The Legion reported in at the crossing markers, one after another, 11,000 hulls holding perfect formation, the enumerated order that had never in 5,000 years been broken by an enemy because no enemy had ever been large enough to break it. Squadron Prime Otten Sur commanded the vanguard, a competent officer of the old school, unimaginative in the way the concordance prized, and his reports were crisp and empty of concern. Approaching the outer markers, no contact. Approaching the 9th marker, no contact. The human fleet had not sortied to meet them. Of course it had not. 4,000 hulls did not sortie to meet 11,000. 4,000 hulls stayed close to the homeworld and hoped, uselessly, that proximity to the planet would make the Legion cautious about its fire. At the 10th marker, Otten Sur's vanguard made contact. Veloth was at the glass when the report came through, and he read it 3 times, and the 3rd time he read it he understood that the unease in the deep places had been right, and that he was very old, and that the word he had promised the command they were about to learn was already being written, and that it was not going to be written in a language any of them knew. Otten Sur's vanguard had made contact with a single vessel. One ship. It was holding station at the 10th marker, alone, 4 full crossings ahead of the human homeworld, in the open dark where nothing waits and nothing lives, and it had made no attempt to hide, and it had made no attempt to flee. And when the Legion's scanning cohorts turned their instruments upon it, the instruments returned figures that the enumerated fleet's 5,000 years of accumulated doctrine had no procedure for receiving, and the vanguard's whole disciplined formation slowed. Without an order to slow, because 11,000 ships full of confident officers had all at once, and all together, realized that they were looking at a thing that was not in the book. Squadron Prime Otten Sur had commanded the vanguard of the 9th Legion for 11 sessions, and in that time he had learned to trust 2 things above all others, the Count and the Calm. The Count told him what force he held. The Calm told him that the Count would be enough. Both had never once failed him. He looked now at the single vessel holding station at the 10th marker, and he felt the Calm begin, for the first time in his career, to slip. The ship was wrong in the way that a shape in deep water is wrong. You could see the outline. You could measure it. But the measuring did not resolve into understanding, and the more you measured the less you understood, until you were left with a set of true numbers that added up to something the mind refused to hold. "Report the mass reading again," Otten Sur said. "Unchanged, Prime," said the scan officer. His name was Delth, and he was a steady sort, and his voice was not steady now. "The vessel masses as a heavy cruiser, consistent with the class of hull we are observing, but the drive signature does not match the mass. The drive signature is consistent with a vessel 40 times that mass, and the thermal shell is consistent with neither." And the Delth stopped. "The vessel is not radiating waste heat at all, Prime. Nothing. A hull that size, running active systems in open dark, should be a beacon. This one is colder than the void around it. We are reading it as a whole. A cold hole holding station, shaped like a ship." "Explain that." "I cannot, Prime." Otten Sur looked at the outline on the glass. It was a long, low hull, blunt at the prow, without the elegant tapering that concordance shipwrights favored, without ornament, without any of the proud heraldry that marked a flagship of a proud navy. It was, he thought, an ugly thing. It looked less like a ship than like a section of something much larger that had been broken off and given engines. Along its flanks he could see the scars, not damage, but the deliberate scars of hard use, scorch marks around weapon ports, panels of mismatched plating where older hull had been cut away and newer welded on, the discoloration of a vessel that had been fired in a forge and then fired again in 100 smaller fights and never once been retired to be made pretty. Points of light ran along its length in a cold, uneven line, window glow and engine glow, perhaps 50 of them, and each one told him that behind the ugliness the thing was fully alive and fully manned and fully awake. It was not in the survey. That was the fact he kept returning to. The forward assessors had counted 4,100 hulls in the Sol system, and this was not among them, and it was 4 crossings ahead of the system, waiting in the empty dark on the road the Legion would take, which meant it had known the road the Legion would take, which meant that somewhere in the last 19 days a human had looked at the crossing markers and understood exactly where 11,000 concordance ships would emerge, and had sent one vessel to be there first, alone, to wait. That was not the behavior of the frightened. That was the behavior of the certain. "It is hailing us, Prime," said the signal officer. "Of course it is," said Otten, "sir." "Put it through." The human voice came into the Vanguard command deck, and Otten Sir registered, with a small surprise he would remember later as the first genuine thing he felt in the whole engagement, that it was young. The species that received the session sent their eldest to speak, their gravest, the weight of authority marshaled to lend dignity to a terrible hour. This voice was young and light and entirely at ease, and it belonged, the translation cohort flagged the vocal markers a moment later, to a female of the species in the early part of her adult years. "Concordance Vanguard," she said. "This is the dreadnought Cenotaph, forward element of the Cold Armada, Captain Eira Van commanding. You're about a marker closer than I expected. Good. Saves us both a wait." A pause. "I'm going to tell you some things now, and you're going to want to write them down, because your people keep a book and I'd like to be entered correctly. Are your recorders running?" Otten Sir did not answer. He did not need to. The recorders were always running. "I'll assume yes," Captain Van said. "Here's the first thing. You came with 1 legion, 11,000 hulls. That was an insult, and I want you to know we took it as one. Your registrar looked at us and decided that 4,000 of our ships and 1 system was worth exactly 1/81st of your strength. He did his arithmetic, and his arithmetic was wrong, and it was wrong in a very particular way that I'm going to explain, because I think you deserve to understand what's about to happen to you before it happens. You've spent 5,000 years teaching the galaxy that force is a number. Add up the hulls, add up the yields. Whoever has the bigger number wins, and everyone who can count can see who has the bigger number, and so nobody ever has to actually fight. You've made war into accounting. It's very elegant. It's kept the peace in a way, your peace, the peace of the owned. And it works perfectly right up until it meets a people who never agreed that force is a number." The command deck was silent. On the glass, the cold hole shaped like a ship held its station and did not move. "Force isn't a number, Squadron Prime," Captain Van said, and Otten Sir noted that she had his rank, which meant they had been listening to the Legion's internal channels, which should not have been possible. "Force is a verb, it's a thing you do to another thing, and the number only matters if both sides agree to resolve the doing by comparing the numbers and walking away. We don't walk away. We were very clear about that. We told your accountant this is a final war, so the number of your ships isn't the size of your strength, it's the size of the job, and I want you to understand before we start that we looked at 11,000 and we were disappointed, not afraid, disappointed. We were hoping you'd take us seriously." "You are 1 ship," Otten Sir said. He had not meant to answer. The words came out of him from a place of doctrine of 5,000 years of the count and the calm. You are one ship, addressing a legion on the open road alone. Yes, said Captain Van, and he could hear now that she was smiling. I am. Isn't that interesting? Ask yourself why. You have 11,000 ships and I have one, and I came out here to meet you 4 crossings from anything I care about in the open where you have every advantage the void can give you. A frightened people fights close to home where the ground helps them. I came to you. Ask yourself what a captain has to know to do that. Then stop asking because you're out of time. A pause. Squadron Prime. Signal your legion. Tell them the Vanguard made contact and the Vanguard is about to stop reporting. Tell them to come anyway. Tell them all of it to come. It's the last order any of you will give that I'll allow to reach anyone. After this, the road goes quiet, and your people at the far end of it will sit in their listening stations and wait for reports that don't arrive, and that waiting is the first thing we're going to do to you. Now, are your recorders still running? You will not, Otten Sir began. They're running, Captain Van said. Good. Here's the last thing and then we begin. You call the thing you did to us an order to surrender. Where I'm from, there's an older word for it. When someone stands over you and tells you to kneel or die and means it and has the strength to do it, we don't call that an order. We call it an introduction. You've just introduced yourself, Squadron Prime. Now let me introduce the Cold Armada. The cold hole shaped like a ship moved. Otten Sir had commanded warships for 11 sessions and he had seen every speed a vessel could make, and what the cenotaph did was not a speed. It was a relocation. One instant the ship held station at the 10th marker, 40,000 of the Vanguard's units distant, at the edge of engagement range. The next instant it was inside the formation, not near the formation. Inside it, threaded through the disciplined, enumerated order of the Vanguard's leading squadrons, close enough that the great blunt prow filled the viewports of a dozen Concordance cruisers at once, and the scan officers had no time to update the plot, and the fire control cohorts had no solution because there had been no transit to track, no arc, no approach. The ship had simply ceased to be at the far edge and begun to be in the middle. And the doctrine of 5,000 years had no procedure for a thing that did not travel the distance between where it was and where it went. That's not possible, Delth said. It was not a report. It was a man saying a true thing aloud because saying it might make it stop. Then the cenotaph opened fire, and Otten Sir learned the difference between a weapon yield and a weapon. The Concordance measured armament the way it measured everything, in enumerated quantities: throw weight, cycle rate, penetration values against standard shielding, all of it catalogued, all of it comparable, all of it entered into the book so that any officer could look at 2 fleets and know which held the larger number and therefore which would win. By that accounting, the cenotaph was a heavy cruiser and carried a heavy cruiser's guns, and a heavy cruiser's guns against the shielding of an enumerated squadron should have been an irritation, a scratching at armor, a thing the squadron's own return fire would silence in moments. The cenotaph's first salvo removed 4 ships. Not disabled, not broke, removed, struck them and passed through them and out the far side and into the ships beyond, as though the shielding that had turned aside every enemy the Concordance had faced in 5,000 years were a thing the human guns had simply declined to acknowledge. Otten Sir saw the fire lance out, cold and white and utterly silent, and he saw the leading cruiser of the 3rd Squadron come apart along the line the fire drew through it, and he saw the fire continue, undiminished, into the cruiser behind, and the cruiser behind that, and he understood with a lurch in the deep places that the human weapon did not have a yield the way his weapons had a yield. It did not deposit a measured quantity of energy and stop. It did a thing to matter, and the thing it did was not survived by being on the far side of enough armor, because there was no far side. There was only the line the fire drew, and everything on that line ceased. Return fire, Otten Sir said. All squadrons, concentrate on the he did not have a word, the doctrine did not have a word, on the intruder, now. The Vanguard returned fire. 2,000 ships in the leading squadrons brought their guns to bear on a single hull threaded through the middle of them, and the dark lit up with the massed fire of a Concordance battle line, the fire that had ended navies, the fire that no local fleet had ever weathered, and it converged on the cenotaph, and it struck, and Aten Sur watched the massed yield of 2,000 enumerated warships wash over the ugly weathered hull of the human dreadnought and do nothing. Not nothing in the sense of little, nothing in the sense of nothing. The cenotaph did not stagger. Its cold, uneven line of window glow did not so much as flicker. The human ship stood inside the full massed fire of the vanguards leading order the way. A stone stands inside rain, and it kept firing, methodically, without haste, each salvo drawing another cold white line through the formation, each line ending 3 ships, or 4 or 6. And the plot on Aten Sur's glass began to empty from the inside out, the neat enumerated icons of the 3rd and the 7th and the 12th squadrons winking out in the calm, unhurried rhythm of a thing doing a job it had done before. Prime. Delph's voice had gone flat, the flatness of a man watching his own certainty die. Prime, the intruder is not taking damage. I have logged 1,940 confirmed hits from our own line. The intruder is not, there is no effect, Prime. The fire is not reaching it. It is as though our weapons are being declined. Declined. Aten Sur held on to the word because it was the only true one available. The human ship was not shrugging off their fire. Shrugging off implied absorption, implied a shield straining, implied a limit that enough fire would eventually pass. This was a refusal. The fire arrived, and the ship simply did not consent to be affected by it. And there was no straining, and there was no limit. And 2,000 Concordance warships were pouring the accumulated menace of 5,000 years into a hull that had decided their menace did not apply to it. Force is a verb, the young human captain had said. It's a thing you do to another thing. Aten Sur, watching his vanguard die in the calm, unhurried rhythm of the human guns, understood at last what she had meant, and understood that his whole civilization had built its power on the second half of a sentence it had never heard the first half of. The Concordance had spent 5,000 years perfecting the comparison of numbers. It had never once, in all that time, had to actually do force to anyone, because the numbers always did the work, and the enemy always yielded before the doing began. And now, 4 crossings from the human homeworld in the open dark, a single ugly weathered vessel was demonstrating that the comparison of numbers had only ever been a courtesy, a game the strong had agreed to play so that they would not have to find out what the numbers actually meant. The cenotaph had declined to play the game. "Signal the Legion," Aten Sur said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that later in the little time he had left to be proud of anything. "Signal the Legion, priority absolute. Report contact with an uncatalogued human vessel of unknown class. Report that the vanguard is engaged and that our fire is without effect. Report that the intruder's fire is not," he stopped, found the word. "Report that the intruder's fire is not being survived. Report our position and our losses and recommend." He did not finish the recommendation, because that was the moment the signal officer told him, in a voice gone very small, that the Legion channels had stopped carrying, all of them at once, across every band, replaced by a single quiet human voice repeating a single quiet phrase on a loop, and the phrase was, "The road is closed now." The vanguard of the 9th Enumerated Legion had 2,000 ships in its leading order when the cenotaph came inside the formation. 19 minutes later, it had fewer than 300, and those 300 were not fighting. They were trying to run, breaking from the enumerated order that had never been broken, scattering into the dark in every direction. And it did not matter which direction they chose, because the cold hole shaped like a ship was faster than choosing, and it went among them without haste. And one by one the neat icons winked out, and Squadron Prime Aten Sur sat in the command deck of his flagship and watched the arithmetic of 5,000 years be revealed in 19 minutes. As the most expensive lie ever told. The main body of the 9th Legion arrived at the 10th marker 8 hours after the vanguard stopped reporting, and it arrived expecting a fight already won. That was the thing the cold Armada understood, and the Concordance did not, and it was the whole shape of what followed. The main body did not know the vanguard had been erased. The road had gone quiet, and quiet, to a fleet that had never lost, meant the vanguard had swept the locals aside and was pressing on. Silence in the Concordance had only ever meant victory. There was no other thing it could mean. And so the 8,000 hulls of the Legion's main body crossed the 10th marker in perfect enumerated order, guns cold, at cruising disposition, expecting to find the wreckage of a human fleet and a vanguard flush with an easy correction, and found instead the wreckage of the vanguard, drifting in a slow expanding cloud across 4,000 units of empty dark, and one cold hole shaped like a ship, waiting, exactly where it had waited before. Legionary Master Sail Andrew commanded the main body, and Sail Andrew was not a fool. He had risen to command a legion by never once mistaking silence for anything he had not confirmed, and the sight of the vanguard's wreckage cost him perhaps 4 seconds of the calm before he had ordered the whole main body to battle disposition. Guns live, formation tightening from the loose, enumerated crews into the dense interlocking order that Concordance doctrine called the vault. 8,000 ships packed into a defensive lattice so tight that any attacker must face the massed fire of hundreds of hulls from every angle at once. A formation that had, in 5,000 years, never been broken, never even been seriously tested, because no enemy had ever survived long enough to press it. "It is a single vessel," Sail Andrew said, on the command channel that bound the 8,000, and his voice was iron because his officers needed it to be iron. "Whatever it did to the vanguard, it did to ships and crews unprepared in loose order. It has not faced the vault. Nothing has faced the vault and continued to exist. Hold formation. Hold discipline. Let it come to us, and when it comes into the fire of the whole legion, and it ends." He paused and added, because he was not a fool, and signaled the command. "Report the vanguard's loss. Report a human vessel of a class not in the survey, capabilities not in the doctrine. Recommend the grand enumeration prepare. If one ship did this, we must know how many ships they have." The signal did not send. The road was closed. Sail Andrew learned in the next hour every lesson the vanguard had learned, and he learned them in the same order, and the only difference was that he had 8,000 ships instead of 2, and the vault instead of the cruise, and so it took the cenotaph not 19 minutes but a little over 2 hours, and Sail Andrew was able to tell himself in the last of that time that he had at least made the human captain work. He had not made her work, he learned that too. The cenotaph did not come into the vault. That was the first lesson, and it undid the whole doctrine of the formation, because the vault was built to punish an attacker who entered it, and the human ship declined to enter. It stood off. At a distance the Concordance guns could reach. Sail Andrew confirmed they could reach it, confirmed the massed fire of the whole legion converged on the cold hull exactly on target, and the massed fire did nothing, exactly as it had done nothing to the vanguard, and the human guns reached back across the same distance and drew their cold white lines through the outer shell of the vault, and the vault's genius, its dense interlocking depth, became its execution. Because the human fire did not stop at the first hull it struck. It passed through, and through, and through, and a formation packed edge to edge for mutual protection was a formation in which a single line of human fire, entering at the surface and refusing to stop, unstitched a corridor of ships all the way to the far side. The tighter the vault, the deeper each shot reached. Sail Andrew ordered the formation to loosen, and loosening under fire from a faster enemy was its own catastrophe, and by the time he understood that there was no disposition, tight or loose, near or far, that changed the outcome, that the outcome was not a function of anything he did, because the human ship was not fighting his fleet so much as processing it. By the time he understood that, he had 4,000 ships, and then 2, and then the human captain's young voice came onto his command channel. The channel that bound the whole legion, the channel no enemy had ever reached, and she did not gloat, and that was the worst of it. "Legionary Master," she said, "you fought that better than the vanguard did. I want you to know I noticed. The vault is a good formation. Against anyone who fights the way you expect them to fight, it's probably unbeatable. That's the trap your people built for yourselves. You got so good at winning the war everyone else agreed to fight that you forgot there were other wars. I'm going to leave you your flagship and about 40 hulls. Do you understand why?" Sale Andrew understood why. He was not a fool. "You want me to carry the report?" "I want you to carry the report," Captain Van agreed. "The road's been closed this whole time, and I'm going to keep it closed for everyone but you. You're going to run home, Legionary Master, you and your 40 ships, and you're going to arrive at your command, and you're going to tell them what you saw. And they're not going to believe you. That's the part I want you to brace for, because it's going to be the hardest thing. You're going to stand in front of the people who keep the book, and you're going to tell them that 11,000 ships met one ship and 40 came back. And they're going to look at their arithmetic, which has never been wrong in 5,000 years, and they're going to decide that you failed, that you fought badly, that the loss was in you and not in the numbers, because the alternative is that the numbers were never the thing. And they can't afford to believe that. So they'll blame you and they'll send more ships, more numbers, a bigger correction, because a bigger number is the only answer their whole civilization knows how to give. A pause. Let them. That's the war, Legionary Master. Every time they answer us with a bigger number, we'll show them again that force was never a number, and the lesson will cost them more, and they'll answer with a number bigger still, because they cannot stop, because stopping means admitting the thing they cannot admit. We'll do this as many times as it takes. We told your accountant, it's a final war. It ends one way. You cannot fight the whole concordance, Sale Andrew said. 40 ships. 2 hours ago he had commanded 8,000. You are one ship. Legionary Master, said Captain Van gently, we haven't sent you a fleet. We sent you one dreadnought and a captain who's 4 years out of the academy to meet your best Legion 4 crossings from anything we care about, and we haven't so much as scratched the cold Armada's paint. You still think this is us? Go home, tell them what you saw, and when they ask you how many of us there are, tell them we didn't say, tell them we laughed, tell them we're still laughing. That's the message. Now run before I change my mind about the 40. Sale Andrew ran. He ran with 40 hulls out of 11,000, back down the road that was open only for him, and behind him the cenotaph resumed its station at the 10th marker, alone, cold, patient, waiting for the next legion the way a tide waits for the next stone. And Sale Andrew carried his 40 ships and his impossible report the 19 days home, and every one of those days he rehearsed the telling, and every one of those days he knew the young captain had been right, and that they would not believe him, and that the not believing would be a kind of madness he would have to endure with his eyes open. He was right, they did not believe him. The Concordance Command received Legionary Master Sale Andrew in the assembly of the ledger, in the great tiered chamber on the vault world Asuar, where the first speakers had ratified the absorption of 911 civilizations, and they listened to his report, and when he had finished, when he had told them of the cold hull that fire could not reach, and the guns that did not stop at armor, and the ship that did not travel the distance it crossed, and the young captain's voice on the Legion's own channels, and the 40 hulls out of 11,000, the assembly of the ledger was silent for a long moment, and then the first speaker of the enumerated fleets, an ancient and decorated sail named Vorad Kell, said the thing that Captain Ira Van had promised he would say. You fought badly, Legionary Master. Sale Andrew had braced for it. He had rehearsed his endurance for 19 days, and still it landed like a blow because it was said not in anger but in certainty, the flat certainty of a man reading an accounting, and Sale Andrew understood in that moment the depth of the thing the human captain had seen from 4 crossings away. The Concordance could not hear his report. Could not. The report was not survivable to them. It said that force was not a number, and their entire civilization, every institution, every rank, every one of 911 entries in the ledger, rested on the axiom that force was a number, and a thing that cannot be true without unmaking your whole world is a thing you will call a lie no matter how much of your fleet it has already eaten. First speaker, Sale Andrew said, I fought the vault. The vault has never been broken. I held 8,000 hulls in the tightest disposition our doctrine permits, and the enemy's fire passed through the depth of the formation as if the depth were not there, and the tighter I held, the more it killed. I did not fight badly. I fought the way 5,000 years taught me to fight, and 5,000 years was wrong, and the being wrong is not in me. It is in the book. The book has 911 entries, said Voradkel. It has never once been wrong. The book, said Sale Andrew, and he was very tired, and the tiredness made him brave, has 911 entries, first speaker, and every one of them is a people who agreed to be counted. That was never the same thing as the book being right. It was only the same thing as no one ever refusing to open it. He straightened. I have brought you the enemy's message. They asked me to carry it, and I have carried it. Will you hear it? The assembly stirred. Voradkel's ancient face did not change. Speak it. They said we would answer them with a bigger number, Sale Andrew said. They said it is the only answer our civilization knows how to give. They said that every time we answer with a bigger number, they will show us again that force was never a number, and that the lesson will cost us more each time, and that we will not be able to stop, because stopping means admitting the thing we cannot admit. They said it is a final war, and that it ends one way. He looked around the tiered chamber at the keepers of the ledger at 5,000 years of certainty. And I stand before you, first speaker, having lost 11,000 hulls to one ship, and I watch you preparing already in your faces to answer them with a bigger number. They told me you would. They knew you before you spoke. I would ask the assembly to consider what it means, that our enemy can predict us this exactly, and we cannot predict them at all. For a moment, Sale Andrew would remember this moment for the rest of his short life. For a moment, something moved behind Voradkel's ancient eyes that might have been the beginning of doubt. Then the first speaker of the enumerated fleet set it aside, because the alternative was the end of his world, and he said the words that Captain Ira Van had known he would say, 4 crossings and 19 days and 11,000 ships ago. Muster the grand enumeration, said Voradkel. All 80 legions, 900,000 hulls. We will show this single system what overwhelming force means. He rose. And strike Legionary Master Sale Andrew from command, for the loss of the 9th. A man who fights well does not lose 11,000 ships to 1. And so the concordance answered with a bigger number, exactly as it had been told it would, and the young captain at the 10th marker, when the news of the mustering reached her, as all the concordance's news now reached her, for the road was closed only in the direction the concordance chose to believe, did not gloat, and did not fear, and only signaled back to the cold armada on the deep channels, the message that would begin the second phase of the war she had promised would end one way. They're bringing all of it. Good. Wake the rest of the fleet. Signal keeper Neth Aldu had joined the grand enumeration 11 days before it sailed, and she was young enough to still believe the arithmetic, and old enough to have already learned that saying so was the whole of a career. She was a keeper of the signal plot aboard the ossuary of days, the command hull of the first speaker himself, a dreadnought so vast that the 9th Legion's whole vanguard could have berthed in its launch bays, and from her station she could see the entire grand enumeration arrayed across the plot. 900,000 hulls, 80 legions, the accumulated fleet of 5,000 years of never losing, mustered in a formation so large that light took most of an hour to cross it, a wall of concordant steel that filled the dark from edge to edge of every instrument she had. She had never seen anything so large. No one had. The grand enumeration had not been fully mustered in 600 years, because in 600 years no threat had been large enough to require it, and Neth Aldu looked at the wall of ships and felt the arithmetic settle over her like a warm garment and thought, whatever the human ship is, it cannot be enough for this. Nothing could be enough for this. She would remember thinking that. She would remember it the way one remembers the last easy breath before an illness. The grand enumeration made the crossing to Sol in 12 days, its drives so numerous that they tore the dark, and it emerged not at the 10th marker but at the 4th, deep inside the human system's near approaches, because the first speaker had studied the loss of the 9th Legion and drawn from it the one lesson his arithmetic would permit him to draw, that the human ship was fast and had chosen the ground, and that the answer was to give it no ground to choose. Arrive close. Arrive overwhelming. Put 900,000 hulls between the human dreadnought and its homeworld in a single stroke, and let the young captain look upon a number so vast that even a people who claimed force was a verb would have to concede that some verbs simply cannot be performed. The grand enumeration emerged at the 4th marker, into the near dark of the human system, and Neth Aldu, at her signal plot aboard the ossuary of days, saw the human fleet for the first time, and understood that the concordance had been holding a conversation with a closed door, and had mistaken the door for the house. There was not one ship. The cold armada filled the dark ahead of the grand enumeration, and it filled it the way the grand enumeration filled the dark behind her, edge to edge of every instrument, a second wall of steel facing the first, and Neth Aldu's plot, trying to count it, returned a number and then discarded it and returned a larger one, because the human fleet was arrayed in depth, layer behind layer, and the instruments kept finding more of it the harder they looked. Cold hulls. Ugly, weathered, blunt-prowed, scarred, each one a cousin of the cenotaph that had eaten the 9th Legion, and there were not 4,000 of them, the number the survey had counted, the number the whole session had been calculated upon. There were the plot fought with itself and finally committed, there were somewhere above 200,000. That is not possible, said the officer beside Neth Aldu, and it was the sentence of the whole war, the sentence the vanguard had said and the vault had said, and now the grand enumeration said, the concordance's one true prayer. The survey counted 4,000 hulls in this system. Where were they? Where do 200,000 warships hide? They had not hidden. Neth Aldu understood that later when it no longer mattered, when the understanding was only a weight to carry. They had not hidden anywhere. The survey had counted 4,000 because 4,000 was what a survey could count: ships in port, ships in transit, ships that lived somewhere an assessor could find them and enter them in a book. The rest had simply not been where the book could see them. Hulls with no berth. A count that was a floor and not a ceiling. The old Registrar Veloth had read that notation at Ossuar 9 and been troubled by it, and he had been right to be troubled, and the trouble had been this: a species that decides calmly, in coordinated millions, to wage a final war does not keep its whole strength in port where it can be counted. It builds in the dark. It builds where no assessor goes. It builds 200,000 warships and lets the concordance's forward eyes count 4,000, and it laughs when the ultimatum comes, because it has known, the whole time, exactly how large the misunderstanding was. The cold armada had not been the cenotaph. The cenotaph had been the cold armada's forward picket, its scout, one ship sent to meet the 1st Legion, because one ship was all the 1st Legion had been worth. Neth Aldu's plot showed the two walls of steel facing each other across the near dark of the human system, 900,000 against 200,000, and the arithmetic reasserted itself in her mind, weakly, a habit rather than a belief. The concordance still held the larger number. 900,000 was more than 200,000. The book still balanced if you only looked at the count. And then the human transmission came on every concordance channel at once, the way the young captain's voice had come onto the 9th Legion's channels, and it was not the young captain this time. It was a chorus, the layered, coordinated, many-voiced sound that had come back to the session as laughter, But it was not laughing now. It was counting. It counted down from 10. "They are ranging us," someone said, and they were not. Neth Aldu knew they were not, because ranging did not require a countdown, and a countdown broadcast to your enemy served no tactical purpose at all, and served instead only one purpose, which was to be understood. The humans wanted the concordance to hear the count. They wanted 900,000 hulls to sit in perfect enumerated order and listen to a chorus of human voices count backward from 10, and know that something was arriving at the end of it, and be able to do nothing but wait for the number to reach 0, exactly as the concordance had made 911 civilizations sit and wait through the session clock, powerless, listening to their own doom approach on a schedule they did not set. It was, Neth Aldu understood, a translation. The humans had taken the cruelty of the session, the patient countdown to a foregone conclusion, and they had handed it back, in the concordance's own grammar, so that the keepers of the book would experience, in the last moments before it happened to them, precisely the thing they had done to 911 worlds. The count reached 0. The cold armada opened fire, and Neth Aldu learned that the thing the cenotaph had done to the 9th Legion had been done gently. One ship drawing cold white lines through a formation was a horror. 200,000 ships doing it at once was not a horror, because a horror is a thing the mind can hold, and this could not be held. The whole face of the grand enumeration, the leading legions, 30 of them, 330,000 hulls in the tightest vault the concordance could form, because the first speaker had learned that much, had formed the vault at once, had done the one thing his doctrine offered, the whole face of it simply ceased to be, not over hours, not over minutes, but in the first shared instant of the cold armada's fire. 200,000 cold white lines entering the formation and passing through its depth and not stopping, and the tightness of the vault that had killed the 9th Legion killed 30 legions in a single breath. The depth of the formation unstitched all at once along 200,000 lines, and the plot in front of Neth Aldu, which had shown 30 legions of the leading order, showed, between one refresh and the next, drifting metal. She did not scream. She noted distantly that she did not scream, and that no one around her screamed, and that the command deck of the ossuary of days had gone entirely silent, the silence of a great many people all at once encountering a fact too large to react to. The first speaker, Vorad Kel, stood at the center of his command deck, ancient and decorated, the keeper of 5,000 years, and he looked at the plot where 30 legions had been, and Neth Aldu, watching him, saw the exact moment the arithmetic died in him, and saw that its dying did not free him. He had built his whole self upon the count. With the count gone, there was nothing behind it. He did not rage and he did not weep. He simply stood, hollowed, a keeper whose book had been proven a lie in the space of a breath, and he gave the only order a man with nothing left behind the count could give. "Return fire," Vorad Kel said. "All legions, the full enumeration. Everything." 600,000 hulls fired on the cold armada, and Neth Aldu watched the accumulated menace of 5,000 years cross the near dark and arrive upon the ugly weathered ships of the human fleet, and she watched the human fleet decline it, exactly as the cenotaph had declined the fire of the vanguard, 200,000 cold hulls standing inside the massed fire of the greatest fleet the galaxy had ever assembled, and not flickering, not staggering, not so much as noticing. And she understood at last fully, the way the vanguard had understood and the vault had understood, and now the grand enumeration understood, the thing the young captain had said at the 10th marker, and the whole concordance had refused to hear. Force was not a number. The concordance had the larger number. It had always had the larger number. It had built 5,000 years and 911 entries, and the whole architecture of its piece on the certainty that the larger number wins. And the certainty had never been tested, because no one had ever refused to compare numbers and walk away. And now a people who had never agreed that force was a number had refused. and was demonstrating, across the whole face of the near dark, that the number had been a courtesy the entire time. A game the strong agreed to play, so they would never have to learn what the strength actually was. The cold Armada's fire fell on the grand enumeration, and the grand enumeration's fire fell on nothing, and Neth Aldu, at her signal plot aboard the command hull of the first speaker, began, methodically, because she was young and wanted to be entered in the book correctly, to record everything she saw. Legion Commander Rael Osk had one idea left, and he spent the last hour of his life proving it wrong. He commanded the 40th Legion, deep in the body of the grand enumeration, far enough back that he had watched the leading 30 legions cease to exist before his own guns had fired a shot, and in the watching he had done a thing that almost no other officer in the enumerated fleets managed to do in the whole war. He had thought, not reach for the count, thought. The human fleet declined their fire. Every hull that fired on it saw its fire refused. But refusal, Rael Osk reasoned, must have a mechanism, and a mechanism must have a form, and a form must have a limit, because that was the one thing 5,000 years of doctrine still insisted upon, and the one thing that might yet be true, that everything had a limit if only you could reach it. Their guns did not stop at armor. Their ships did not stop for fire. But no one had tried to reach the human hulls with anything but fire. No one had tried mass. Bring the 40th to ramming disposition, Rael Osk ordered, and his officers, who had no thought of their own left, obeyed the first officer, who had one. All hulls. We do not fire. Firing is refused. We close and we ram. A ship may decline a weapon's yield. Let us learn whether it can decline 11,000 tons of hull at speed. Mass is not a yield. Mass is a fact. Close on the nearest human hull and strike it with everything the Legion is. It was, Veloth would later judge when the records reached him, the single most intelligent order given by any concordance officer in the entire war, and it failed as completely as the stupidest, and the manner of its failing taught the 40th Legion the last lesson the grand enumeration had left to learn. The 40th closed on a single human hull, a cold, weathered dreadnought, cousin to the Cenotaph, holding station in the human line, 11,000 concordance ships driving in at ramming speed, guns cold, 11,000 hulls of massed steel converging on one, and for the length of the run Rael Osk allowed himself to believe. Mass was a fact. Mass could not be declined. Whatever the human ship did to fire, it could not do to the physical arrival of 11,000 tons of steel at speed, because the arrival was not an energy the hull could refuse. It was matter, meeting matter, and matter did not negotiate. The lead ships of the 40th reached the human hull, and Rael Osk learned that matter did negotiate, if the humans were the ones who owned the terms of the meeting. The human ship did not evade. It did not fire. It did the thing it had done at the 10th marker, the thing that had no procedure in 5,000 years of doctrine. It relocated. Not fast, there was no fast, there was no arc, no transit, no run to track. The lead ships of the 40th drove in at their target, and their target simply ceased to be at the point of impact and began to be elsewhere, a quarter crossing distant, holding station, cold, as though it had never been where the 40th had aimed at all, and the lead ships of the 40th, committed to ramming speed with nothing left to ram, drove on into the space where the human hull had been and struck, at full ramming velocity, each other. Rael Osk watched his own Legion ram itself. 11,000 hulls at ramming speed, converging on a point that no longer held a target, and physics, which the humans understood all the way down to the bottom, and the concordance had never once had to learn, did to the 40th exactly what the 40th had intended to do to the human ship. Mass met mass. The fact could not be declined. The 40th Legion tore itself apart in the empty dark, 11,000 ships arriving at a single point at speed with nothing there to receive them but one another, and the human hull held station a quarter crossing away and did not fire, because it did not need to, because the Legion commander's one intelligent idea had done the work for it. "It moved," said Rail Osk scan officer, in the flat voice of a man narrating his own end. "At the moment of impact, Commander, it moved. It let us commit. It let us reach ramming speed with no way to abort, and then it simply was not there, and we, Commander, we struck ourselves. The 40th struck itself." Rail Osk understood, in the last minutes, the full shape of what had beaten him, and it was worse than being outgunned. It was being outthought so completely that his best idea had become the human's weapon. The young captain had not needed to defeat the ramming charge. She had needed only to let it happen, to time a relocation to the moment past which the 40th could not stop, and to let the Legion's own mass and the Legion's own speed and the Legion's own cleverness do the killing. Mass is a fact, he had told his officers. He had been right. It had simply never once occurred to him that the humans knew the fact better than he did, and would arrange for the fact to arrive on his own hulls instead of theirs. "Commander," his signal officer said, "there is a transmission, the human hull. It is directed to you, to the 40th specifically." Rail Osk closed his eyes. "Play it." The young captain's voice, when it came, was not cruel, and that was the worst of it, because Rail Osk had earned cruelty. He had tried, at least, to kill her, which was more than most of the Grand Enumeration had managed. "Legion Commander," Captain Van said, "that was the best idea anyone in your whole fleet has had. I want you to know I saw it, and I know what it cost you to think it, when everyone around you had stopped thinking at all. You were right about mass. You were right that we can't decline it. You were wrong about only one thing, and it's the thing your whole civilization has been wrong about since the 10th marker. You assumed that because we could be reached, we could be surprised. We can't. Not because we're gods. Because we've fought this exact fight, a faster enemy against a mass charge, 1,000 times against each other, all the way down through our whole history, and there is no version of it we haven't already seen and buried our own people learning. You had the idea for the first time an hour ago. We had it and lost ships to it and solved it 10,000 years before you were born. That's the whole war, Commander. You're a brilliant people meeting your first real fight. We're an old people who never got to have any other kind. I'm sorry. You deserve to win with an idea that good, against almost anyone you would have." A pause. "It's on the record now. The 40th had the best idea in the Grand Enumeration. Let that be your entry. It's more than the first speaker's going to get. The 40th Legion died in the empty dark, killed by its own mass and its own speed and its own one good idea, and Rail Osk died with it. And he was, in the strange accounting of the war, one of the few the humans genuinely mourned, the enemy officer who had thought, when thinking was hardest, and had been right about everything except the one thing no amount of thinking could have told him. That he was fighting a people for whom his first war was their 10,000th, and that there was no idea he could reach for that they had not already reached for, and lost too, and learned, in the long, brutal schooling of a species that had never once been rich enough to make war into arithmetic. The young captain's voice came onto the ossuary of days an hour into the dying, and by then the Grand Enumeration had lost half its strength, and Neth Aldu had recorded all of it, and she found herself, when the human voice began to speak, unable to look away from the face of the first speaker, because she wanted to see what a man who had been god of the arithmetic did when the arithmetic spoke back to him in a stranger's voice. "First speaker Vorad Kell," said Captain Van, "you can hear me. I know you can because I'm on the channel that only your command hull carries, the one your fleet doesn't share, and I want this next part to be between us. The rest of your enumeration doesn't need to hear a first speaker be spoken to like this. You've earned that much. You built a peace that lasted 5,000 years. It was a piece of the owned, and it was held up by a lie, but it was real, and a lot of species that would otherwise have burned themselves to ash in their own little wars got to keep existing under your book instead. I'm not going to pretend that's nothing, so I'm going to give you something none of your victims ever got. I'm going to tell you the truth about what's happening to you, and then I'm going to give you a choice, and it's a real choice, which is more than your session ever was." Voradkel did not answer, but Neth Aldu saw his ancient hands, folded at the center of the command deck, tightened by a fraction. "Here's the truth," Captain Van said. "You think you're losing a battle, you're not. You've already lost it. The battle ended in the first 10 seconds when your leading 30 legions stopped existing, and everything since then has been my fleet doing arithmetic, the slow kind, the kind you understand, subtracting your hulls from the total, 1 legion at a time, at whatever pace we choose. There is nothing you can do to change the outcome. I want you to sit inside that fact for a moment, first speaker, because it's a fact your people have handed to 911 others and never once had to hold yourselves. The outcome is fixed. Your only remaining decision is what it costs. Do you understand? You're where the worlds you ordered to kneel have always been. The only thing left to you is the terms." "You speak of terms," Voradkel said. His voice was steady, the last steadiness of 5,000 years. "Name them." "I'll name them," Captain Van said. "Stand down the enumeration. All of it, not just the hulls in this system, all of it, every legion, every yard, every listening station, the whole apparatus of the session. Open the ledger to us. Every world you own walks free today with everything you took from it. And you, the speakers, the keepers, the ones who did the arithmetic, you answer for the 911, not death. We don't want your death. Death is cheap and it teaches nobody. You answer. You stand in front of the peoples you cataloged and you account, out loud, for what you did to them, and then you live in whatever world they choose to build without you at the top of it. Those are the terms. Stand down, open the book, and answer. Do that and the war ends today and your species continues diminished, owned by no one, entered into no book but continuing. Continuation, first speaker. The one thing you never let anyone refuse. I'm offering it to you now." It was, Neth Aldu thought, a merciful offer. It was more mercy than the Concordance had ever extended. And she watched the first speaker of the enumerated fleets, the keeper of the ledger, the god of the arithmetic, receive it. And she saw that he could not take it, and she understood why. And the understanding was the most terrible thing she learned in the whole war. He could not take it because taking it meant that force was not a number. That was the thing. If the arithmetic was real, then he had done nothing wrong. He had merely applied a law of nature, as inevitable as gravity, and the 911 had submitted to a law and not to a crime, and there was no guilt in a law. But if he stood down, if he opened the book and answered for the session, then he was conceding that it had never been a law at all. That the whole 5,000 years had been not the application of an inevitable force, but the exercise of a choice to threaten and to take, made freely, over and over, 911 times, and that every submission he had counted as a peace had in fact been a robbery he had committed because he could. The young captain was not offering him continuation. She was offering him continuation at the price of understanding himself to be a criminal on a scale no mind could hold. And Voradkel, ancient and hollowed and standing in the wreckage of his fleet, could not pay it, because there was not enough of him behind the arithmetic to survive the paying. "No," said the first speaker. "I know," said Captain Van, and there was no triumph in it, only a great and cold tiredness. "I knew before I asked, but you deserved the asking, and the peoples you catalogued deserved to have it on the record that you were offered continuation and you chose this instead. It's in your book now, first speaker. Enter it accurately." A pause. "What are you reaching for?" Because Voradkel had turned from the plot. He had turned to the deep station at the rear of the command deck, the sealed station, the one Neth Aldu had never seen opened in her 11 days aboard, the one the oldest officers spoke of only obliquely, and he laid his ancient hand upon it, and he spoke the words that unsealed it, and Neth Aldu felt the whole command deck go cold, because she knew, everyone knew, what the sealed station was for. "You have made an error," Voradkel said, and for the first time there was something in his voice besides the arithmetic, and the something was hatred. You have assumed that because I cannot defeat your fleet, I cannot end you. But the ledger has a final column, human. In 5,000 years we have written in it twice. It is the column for a world that will neither submit nor be defeated, the column for a people who must simply cease so that the book may go on. You have declared a final war. So will I. If I cannot own your species, I will subtract it, not your fleet. Your fleet is beyond my reach, I concede it. But your fleet came from a world, and your world circles a star, and the cessation engine does not care how fast your ships are, or how your guns ignore my armor, or how you hide 200,000 hulls from a survey. The cessation engine unmakes a star. I will unmake yours. I will remove the hearth your whole species warms itself at, and your 200,000 invulnerable ships will win this battle and sail home to a system with no home in it. And you will learn, human, that the number was real after all, because there is no verb you can perform upon a star that has ceased to exist. He gave the order. Deep in the ossuary of days, the cessation engine woke, a thing the concordance had built in its first century and used twice and sealed away in shame and pride, a weapon that did to a star what the human guns did to a hull, that drew a line and ended everything on it. Only the line reached across a whole system, and the everything was a sun. Neth-Aldu felt the command hull shudder as the engine drank the power of 30 legions worth of reactors, and on the plot, a single cold point of purpose detached from the ossuary of days and began to cross the near dark toward the small yellow star at the heart of the human system. And the star was Sol, and around it circled the world that had laughed at the session, and the cessation engine did not travel fast, but it did not need to, because it could not be stopped. Because nothing had ever stopped it, because it was the final column of the ledger, and the final column had never once failed to balance the book. Captain Ira Van's voice came onto the channel, and for the first time in the whole war, Neth-Aldu heard it change. It did not fill with fear. That was the thing she would carry. She had expected fear. The human world was under the engine now, the hearth of the whole species, and surely even a people who claimed force was a verb would fear the unmaking of their son. But the young captain's voice did not fill with fear. It filled instead with something older and colder and final, the sound of the last small warmth going out of a thing. And Neth-Aldu understood that she had just heard the concordance do the one thing that could not be undone, the one thing that removed the last mercy from the table, and that whatever the humans had been willing to leave standing before the first speaker reached for his final column, they were not willing to leave it standing now. "First Speaker Vorad Kell," said Captain Ira Van, "you have just fired on our star." A silence. "I offered you continuation, I meant it. There was a version of today where your species went on. You have just closed it. Not because the engine will work, it won't, and I'll show you why in a moment, and you're going to wish it had. You've closed it because of what firing it means. You have told me in the only language that can't lie that there is no floor beneath you. That there is no atrocity you will not reach for. That if you cannot own us, you will erase us. And if you cannot erase us, you will reach for the next thing, and the next forever, because a people who will unmake a star rather than answer for a crime is a people that will never, ever stop. I believed an hour ago that you could be allowed to continue. You have corrected me. Thank you for that. It would have been a terrible mistake." A pause, and then the last of the warmth went out of her voice entirely. "Watch your engine, first speaker. Watch what happens to the final column of your book." Neth-Aldu watched. The cessation engine crossed the near dark toward Sol, unstoppable, the weapon that had ended 2 worlds and would end a 3rd. And as it crossed, 3 of the cold armada's ugly, weathered hulls detached from the human line and moved to meet it, not to destroy it. Neth-Aldu saw, because they made no attempt to fire on it. They moved to be in front of it. They interposed themselves between the engine and the star, 3 cold hulls against a weapon that unmade suns, and Neth-Aldu braced for their ending, because, whatever the human guns could decline, surely the final column of the ledger could not be declined. The cessation engine reached the 3 human ships, and the line it drew, the line that ended everything, arrived upon their weathered hulls, and Neth Aldu saw the cold white unmaking of it wash over them exactly as the Grand Enumeration's fire had washed over them. And exactly as the Grand Enumeration's fire had washed over them, it did nothing, and the 3 ugly ships stood inside the ending of a star and declined it, and the cessation engine, having drawn its line and found the line refused. Having reached across the near dark to unmake a sun and been met by 3 weathered hulls that simply would not permit it, faltered and guttered. And Neth Aldu did not have the physics for what she saw next, and neither did anyone aboard the Ossuary of Days. The engine's own unmaking refused a target, turned back upon itself, and the final column of the ledger, the weapon that had ended 2 worlds, ceased to exist in a cold white flash that left not even drifting metal. And the small yellow star at the heart of the human system went on burning, exactly as it had burned for 5 billion years, warming the world that had laughed. The command deck of the Ossuary of Days was silent, and in the silence Neth Aldu heard the first speaker of the enumerated fleets make a sound she had no name for, a small broken exhalation, the sound of the last thing a man believes in going out. Vorad Kel had fired the final column of the ledger, the weapon that had never failed at a star, and 3 ugly weathered ships had stood in front of it and refused it, and it had turned upon itself and died, and the star went on burning, and there was now nothing left. No arithmetic, no fleet. The Grand Enumeration was down to 1/3 of its strength and falling, the human line subtracting it legion by legion at whatever pace they chose. No final column. Nothing behind the count, and the count was gone. It cannot be refused, Vorad Kel said. He was not speaking to anyone. He was speaking to 5,000 years. The cessation engine cannot be refused. It is not a weapon that a shield turns aside. It unmakes the thing it is aimed at. There is no armor against the unmaking of a star. There is no, it cannot be refused. It has never been refused. It is the final column. It is the thing that balances the book when nothing else will balance it. First speaker, said Captain Ira Van gently on the private channel, it was refused. You watched it be refused. I want you to stop telling yourself it can't be, and I want you to ask the question you've been refusing to ask for the last hour, because it's the only question left that matters, and I'll answer it honestly if you'll ask it. Vorad Kel was silent a long moment. Then, in the voice of a man very far from land, he asked it. What are you? He said. What is your species? That force is not a number to you, that your ships decline our fire, that your guns do not stop at armor, that 3 of your hulls can stand in front of the unmaking of a star and simply decline it. What are you? And the young captain's voice, when it answered, was not cold and was not cruel and was, Neth Aldu thought, almost kind, the kindness of someone explaining a hard thing to a child who has finally grown quiet enough to hear it. We're not anything you don't have a word for, said Captain Ira Van. That's the part that's going to be hardest for you, first speaker, when you have time to think about it. We're not gods. We're not ancient. We're younger than your concordance by a long way. We don't have some secret the galaxy withheld from you. Our ships aren't magic, and our guns aren't magic, and the 3 hulls that ate your engine did it with physics your own scientists could have found, if your civilization had ever once been forced to look. That's the whole answer. You never had to look. For 5,000 years the number won every fight before the fight happened, and so you stopped developing the things a people develops when the number isn't enough. You stopped asking what force actually is, underneath the counting, because you never needed to know. And we asked. That's all. We're a species that fought its wars all the way down to the bottom, over and over on our own soil, against each other, for our whole history, until we understood force the way a people only can when the counting has failed them 1,000 times, and they had to learn what was underneath it. You made war into accounting, and you got very rich and very safe and very old. We never got to make war into accounting. We had to keep learning what it actually was. And now you've met a people who knows, and you don't, and the not knowing is 5,000 years deep, and there is no number large enough to buy it back. Force all the way down to the bottom. Neth Aldu, recording, felt the words settle into her like cold water. The concordance had won so completely for so long that it had forgotten how to fight, and had mistaken the forgetting for peace, and had gone soft in the way that only the endlessly victorious go soft, not in courage, not in will, but in understanding. And the humans, who had never been allowed the luxury of the winning number, had spent their whole brutal history learning the thing the concordance had been rich enough to skip. "You are going to end us," Vorod said. "It was not a question now." "We're going to end the concordance," said Captain Eiravan. "There's a difference, and you're going to spend the rest of your life failing to understand it, and that failure is going to be your whole punishment, so let me at least give you the words. We're not going to end your species. We're going to end the thing your species built, the ledger, the session, the arithmetic, the ownership of 911 worlds. That ends. It ends completely, and it ends soon, and it ends at Aswar, at the seat of it, at the book itself. But the Sale who never kept the ledger, the ones who only ever lived under it the way the owned worlds lived under it, they'll go on. It's you, first speaker. It's the keepers. It's the men and women who did the arithmetic and called it a law of nature. That's who this final war is for, not your people, your institution. We're going to unmake the thing that made kneeling into mathematics, and we're going to do it so thoroughly that 10,000 years from now, when some other rich and frightened empire is tempted to tell a smaller people that force is a number and resistance is arithmetic, there will be a word in every language in this galaxy for what happens next, and the word will be us. The grand enumeration died over the following 4 hours, and Neth Aldu recorded all of it, and the human fleet, true to the captain's word, left the ossuary of days for last, and left it in the end intact, the command hull of the first speaker, drifting in the wreckage of 900,000 ships, its reactors spent, its engine gone. Its first speaker sitting hollow at the center of a command deck that no longer commanded anything. They left it as they had left Sale Andrew his 40 ships, to carry the report. And the report it would carry was the largest defeat in the history of the galaxy. 900,000 hulls against 200,000, and of the 900,000, when the human fleet finished its slow arithmetic and turned toward Aswar, there remained a little over 11,000, and those 11,000 did not fight, and were not required to, and fled home down a road the humans left open for exactly that purpose, so that the Concordance's heartland would receive. Ahead of the cold armada itself, the news of what was coming. Neth Aldu survived. She survived because she was aboard the one hull the humans chose to spare, and because the young captain had wanted a recorder to carry the recording, and Neth Aldu understood, when the human fleet turned away and left the ossuary of days drifting, that she had been spared for the same reason Sale Andrew had been spared, the same reason the first speaker had been left his hollow flagship. The humans were not interested in killing. They were interested in being understood. The whole war, from the laughter that came back to the session to the 3 ships that ate a star, had been an argument, conducted in the only grammar the concordance could not misread, and the humans wanted witnesses, because an argument without witnesses persuades no one, and the point of a final war, Neth Aldu was beginning to understand, was not the ending of an enemy. It was the teaching of a lesson so total that it would never need to be taught again. She looked at the first speaker, hollow at the center of his dead command deck, and she did the thing that would define the rest of her life, the thing that would, in time, make her the first Sale to testify before the peoples her people had catalogued. She stopped recording the battle. She turned her recorder on Vorod, on the keeper of the ledger sitting in the ruin of the arithmetic, and she began, quietly, to record the truth, not the human fleet's impossible capabilities, which the whole galaxy would soon know, but the smaller and more important truth, the one the concordance had spent 5,000 years and 911 worlds hiding from itself. That it had never been a law of nature. That it had always been a choice. that a people had finally refused it, and in refusing it had proven that everyone could have refused it all along, if only one of them had been willing to make it a final war. Far away, at the listening station Ossuar 9, on the very edge of the Concordance's heartland, the old Registrar Veloth received the first fragments of the news, and he did not need the full report to understand what had happened, because he had understood it already, weeks before, standing at the reception lectern listening to laughter come back with no fear anywhere in it. He had warned the command that they were about to learn a new word. He had been right, and being right gave him no satisfaction at all, because the word was larger than he had imagined, and it was coming now, toward the heartland, toward Ossuar, toward the book itself, and there was nothing in 5,000 years of doctrine that told a registrar what to do when the arithmetic itself was sailing home to be corrected. On the world the Concordance had catalogued as entry 640, which its own people called Ashit. An archivist named Melukor received the recording of Saul on the same channels her grandmother had once received the session, and she watched it 4 times before she understood that her hands had stopped moving. Ashit had been owned for 800 years. Melukor had been born owned, had lived owned, would have died owned and never once thought the word, because on Ashit the ownership was not spoken of as ownership. It was spoken of as the accord, the reasonable arrangement by which Ashit paid its assessed remittance and kept its cities and its harvests and its small local gods, and in exchange did not have to be subtracted from the galaxy by a fleet no world could resist. That was how the Concordance's belief lived on an owned world 8 centuries deep, not as a boot but as common sense. Everyone knew the arithmetic. Everyone knew that resistance was subtraction. To be against the accord was not to be brave. It was to be a fool, a danger to your neighbors, a child who had not learned how the galaxy worked. Melukor had catalogued 3 generations of Ashit's own records under the accord, and had never once, in all that filing, thought of herself as owned, because the belief had done its work so completely that ownership had become whether simply the condition of the sky, not a thing anyone had chosen or could change. And now she watched a single system laugh at the session, and watched the arithmetic sail against it, and watched the arithmetic lose. She watched the 9th Legion die at the 10th marker, 11,000 against 1. She watched the Grand Enumeration die at the 4th marker, 900,000 against 200,000 that a survey had counted as 4,000. She watched 3 ugly weathered ships stand in front of the unmaking of a star and refuse it. And with each thing she watched, something happened inside Melukor that had not happened in 800 years of Ashit's history, and it was not hope, not yet, because hope was too large and too dangerous to reach for all at once. It was smaller and more corrosive than hope. It was the simple collapse of common sense. The thing everyone knew, that force was a number, that resistance was subtraction, that the accord was the weather. The thing everyone knew was not true. She could see that it was not true. It was on the channel 4 times over in cold light. The arithmetic met a people who refused it, and the arithmetic lost. And if the arithmetic could lose, then it had never been a law. And if it had never been a law, then the accord had never been weather. And if the accord had never been weather, then Ashit had not been living under the sky for 800 years. Ashit had been robbed for 800 years, and had filed the robbery, generation after generation, under reasonable arrangement, because a robbery you cannot resist is easier to survive if you agree to call it something else. Melukor was an archivist. She understood, better than most, what it meant that the humans had not destroyed the ledger but opened it. She understood it before the delegates understood it, before the councils understood it, because she had spent her life among records, and she knew the one thing about a record that the powerful always forget. A record kept in secret is a weapon of the keeper, and a record made public is a weapon against him, and the only thing that determines which it is who is permitted to read it. For 800 years the Concordance had kept Ashit's entry sealed, and the sealing had been the whole of its power over her world, not the fleet, which had never once appeared in Ashit's sky, but the entry, the private accounting, the thing that said this world is owned in a book only the owner could read, and the humans were about to unseal it. When Ashit's entry came home, on the 9th day of the opening, in the Concordance's own cold hand, Melucor was the archivist on duty to receive it, because of course she was, because she had not left the archive in 9 days, because she had understood since the 4th viewing of Saul that this was coming, and that she wanted to be the one to receive it. And she read it. She read the survey that had judged Ashit worth taking 800 years before. She read the assessment of its harvests and its industry and its population, rendered in the flat, enumerated font of a people appraising livestock. She read the threat that had been made to the Ashit of 8 centuries past, the count, the yields, the historical record of every world that had refused and been subtracted, and she read the notation, appended by some long-dead assessor that had determined the whole future of her world, target assessed as rational, will submit when shown the count, recommend standard session, no correction anticipated. And she read at the bottom in the same cold hand, the entry that had governed 800 years of her people's life. Entry 640, ASHET, acceded without correction, remittance assessed, sovereignty catalogued, closed. Closed, her whole world 800 years, one word, closed. Melucor sat with the entry a long time. And then she did the thing that the young human captain, 4,000 crossings away, standing beneath a crystalline ledger in the heartland of the arithmetic, had gambled that 911 archivists like Melucor would do. She did not weep, though there was weeping in her. She did not rage, though there was rage. She took the entry, the survey, the threat, the appraisal, the single closing word, and she read it aloud into Ashit's own channels, to her own people, in her own voice, so that every soul on the world that had been owned for 800 years could hear, in the Concordance's own accounting, exactly what had been done to them and exactly how casually it had been done. And then she sent it back up the line, toward Assuar, toward the heartland, so that the keepers of the book would hear their own crime recited home to them in the voice of the 640th world they had robbed. It was not an army. Ashit had no army, that had been the point. It was not a fleet. It was one archivist reading one entry aloud. But across the Concordance, in those 9 days, 911 Melucors read 911 entries aloud, each to its own world, each back to the heartland, and the sound of it, the sound of a galaxy reading its own robbery in the robber's own hand, was the sound of the belief dying, and the belief had been the only thing the Concordance was truly made of, and so the sound of it was the sound of the Concordance dying too. Melucor lived to be old. In the years that followed she became, on Ashit and beyond it, a figure of some renown, one of the archivists who had received the opening and read it home, and young people would come to her and ask what it had been like, that day, to learn that the sky had never been weather. And she would tell them the truth, which was stranger and colder than the story they wanted. She would tell them that the hardest thing had not been the rage or the grief or the 800 stolen years. The hardest thing had been the moment before all of that, the moment when she watched a single system laugh at the session and win, and felt not joy but a kind of vertigo, because in that moment she understood that Ashit could have done it too. Not the winning, Ashit had no fleet, could never have won. But the refusing, the laughing, the choice. For 800 years her people had told themselves that submission was the only rational choice, that the arithmetic left no other, that to resist was to be subtracted, and to be subtracted was to be a fool. And it had all been true, except for the part that mattered, which was that the humans had proven a people could refuse the arithmetic and mean it, and that the refusing itself, win or lose, subtracted or not, was a thing that had always been available, and that Ashit had simply never reached for, because reaching for it had been made unthinkable by a belief that a robber wrote into a book and a whole galaxy agreed to call the weather. That, she would tell the young ones, was the thing the humans gave us, not our freedom, We took that ourselves once the book was open. They gave us back the knowledge that it had always been a choice, and a people that knows its submission was a choice can never quite be owned again, because ownership on that scale was never really made of fleets. It was made of the certainty that no one would ever refuse. The humans spent one final war teaching the galaxy that someone would, and once the galaxy knew it, the arithmetic was over forever, on Ashit and on 910 other worlds, and no count large enough to bring it back has ever been assembled, or ever will be. Asuar had not been defended in 600 years, because Asuar had never needed defending, because the whole point of the arithmetic was that no enemy ever reached the heartland. The enemy was corrected at the border, or corrected in its own system, or most often, never became an enemy at all, submitting at the session before a shot was fired. The vault world at the center of the concordance, where the ledger itself was kept, where the assembly of the speakers had ratified 911 absorptions, had grown for 6 centuries into a thing that was less a fortress than a temple, ringed by the warden legions who had never fired their guns in anger, guarded by defenses so old that half of them were ceremonial. And now the cold armada was coming, and the Registrar Veloth stood in the outer gallery of the assembly of the ledger, and watched the heartland try, in a matter of days, to remember how to be afraid. It was not going well. "The Warden Legion's number 110,000 hulls," said the officer at the muster board, a young sail named Taris Vun, whom Veloth had known since the boy was a cadet, and whose voice had the brittle brightness of someone reciting a comfort he did not believe. Combined with the survivors of the Grand Enumeration, and the Yard Reserves, and the pickets recalled from the near borders, we will have upward of 140,000 hulls in the Asuar approaches when the human fleet arrives. That is, Registrar, that is a larger number than the Grand Enumeration fielded at the 4th marker. We will meet them with a larger number than the one they already. Taris Veloth said, "Stop." The young officer stopped. "You are doing the thing," Veloth said, not unkindly. "You are reaching for the number. We all are. It is the only reflex 5,000 years left us, but you have read the reports from Saul. You know what happened to 900,000 hulls in the first 10 seconds. Adding 40,000 to the total does not change what the human fire does when it arrives. It only changes how many of us are aboard the hulls when it arrives." He looked at the muster board, at the 140,000 icons gathering in the Asuar approaches, and felt the old weariness. We are not assembling a defense. We are assembling a larger number of witnesses to our defeat. And I think, somewhere beneath the reflex, every officer at that board knows it. Taris Vun was quiet. "Then what do we do, Registrar? If the number is not the answer, we have never had another answer. What do we do?" It was, Veloth thought, the first honest question anyone in the Heartland had asked since the news came, and it deserved an honest answer, and he did not have one, because the Concordance had spent 5,000 years ensuring that no one would ever need one. He was spared having to admit it by the arrival of the speaker's summons. The assembly of the ledger was convening in emergency session, and the Registrar of Asuar 9, who had delivered the session to Earth and warned the command of the new word, was called to attend. The assembly chamber was full for the first time in Veloth's memory. Every speaker, every keeper, every senior officer of the Heartland, the whole apparatus of the arithmetic gathered in the great tiered hall beneath the ledger itself. The physical ledger, the vast crystalline archive that held the accounting of 911 worlds, suspended at the chamber's heart, glowing with the cold light of 5,000 years of ownership. And at the speaking floor, where 911 absorptions had been ratified, stood not a speaker but a returned officer, and Veloth's breath caught, because he knew the face, though it had aged a decade in a season. It was Sail Andrew, the legionary master who had lost the 9th Legion and been struck from command and told he had fought badly. He had come back. He had come to the Heartland, unbidden, disgraced, and he had asked to speak before the assembly of the ledger, and something in the panic of the hour had granted it. "I am not here to defend myself," Sale Andrew said, and his voice carried in the silent chamber. "You told me I fought badly. Perhaps I did. It does not matter now, because the thing that killed my legion is 9 days from this chamber, and it will not care how well any of us fights. I am here because I stood closer to it than anyone in this hall, and I heard what it said, and it told me exactly what you would do, and you have done it every step, and I cannot watch you do the last step without speaking." He turned slowly to take in the whole tiered assembly. "Human Captain told me you would answer us with a bigger number. You did the grand enumeration. She told me that when that failed, you would answer with a bigger number still, and here it is." He gestured to the muster reports glowing at the chamber's edge. 140,000 hulls, the Warden legions, the reserves, the bigger number. Even now at the end, with the wreck of 900,000 ships behind us, this assembly's only instinct is the larger count. She predicted this too. She predicted all of it. And I ask you, keepers of the ledger, does it not trouble a single one of you that our enemy has read our entire civilization like a child's primer, and we cannot read them at all? "You counsel surrender," said a speaker from the high tiers, cold. "You counsel that we open the ledger and answer for the session, as their captain demanded of the first speaker. He refused. He was right to refuse. He fired the cessation engine at a star," Sale Andrew said, "and it was refused, and it turned on itself, and he is drifting in the wreck of the greatest fleet in history with nothing left of him at all. That is what his refusal bought. And I do not counsel surrender, speaker, because I heard the captain, and I understood a thing that this assembly has not yet understood, and it is the reason I came all this way to stand on this floor and be shamed a second time." He drew a breath. "It is too late for surrender." That was the offer at Saul, and the first speaker closed it when he reached for the engine. "The humans do not want our surrender now. They have said what they want plainly, and I have carried it, and I will say it once in this chamber beneath the ledger so that it is on the record before the end. They are going to unmake the concordance. Not the sale. The concordance, the ledger, the session, the arithmetic, this chamber, all of it. And they are going to do it whether we assemble 140,000 hulls or none. And the only thing the hulls change is how many keepers die aboard them, pretending the number still means something." The chamber erupted. Veloth watched the assembly of the ledger dissolve into the sound of 5,000 years refusing to end, speakers shouting for the muster to hold, for the Warden legions to advance, for the disgraced legionary master to be removed. And beneath the shouting he watched the ledger itself glow cold and vast and indifferent at the chamber's heart, the crystalline archive of 911 ownerships, and he thought, "It will not save you. The book you spent everything to fill will not add one hull to the defense or turn aside one line of human fire. You made the counting into a god, and the god is a ledger, and a ledger cannot fight." He did not say it. He was an old registrar, and the habit of silence was 5,000 years deep in him too. But he made in that chamber beneath the shouting a small private decision, the first genuinely disobedient decision of his long and obedient life, and it was this: when the cold armada arrived, he would not be aboard a hull, adding himself to the number of witnesses to the defeat. He would be here at the ledger, at the book itself. Because he had begun to suspect what the humans meant to do when they reached the heartland, and he wanted to see it, and he wanted, when it happened, to be standing in exactly the place the whole arithmetic had been kept, so that he could watch it end where it had lived. Across the concordance, in the same days, the owned worlds began to stir. The news of Saul had spread faster than the concordance could contain it, because the humans had wanted it to spread, and had seeded the recordings into the very channels the concordance used to bind its holdings. 911 catalogued civilizations, worlds that had looked at the arithmetic and submitted, worlds that had wept and raged in private, and then signed because continuation could not be refused. 911 own peoples heard all at once that a single system had laughed at the session, and that the arithmetic had met it, and that the arithmetic had lost. And a thing began to move through the owned worlds that the concordance had spent 5,000 years ensuring could never move, the understanding that it had always been a choice. That the submission each of them had told itself was surrender to a law of nature had been, the entire time, surrender to a threat that could have been refused. The humans had proven it could be refused. And 911 peoples, who had each believed themselves alone in their submission, discovered in the space of a season that they were 911, and that the thing that owned them was, at this very moment, 9 days from the seat of its own power, being sailed home to be unmade by a fleet that fire could not touch. The concordance had built its peace on the certainty that no one would ever refuse the arithmetic. It had never once considered what would happen to that peace on the day everyone learned that someone had. In the last days before the cold armada reached Asuar, the Heartland did a thing that no one had ordered and no one could stop. It began to argue with itself. Terrace Vun felt it first in the muster yards, where the Warden legions were being readied for a battle that half the crews had already privately concluded they would not survive. The concordance had never argued. That was the strange truth Terrace Vun kept returning to as he moved through the yards, checking the readiness of hulls whose captains would not meet his eyes. For 5,000 years the concordance had not needed to argue, because the arithmetic settled everything before an argument could begin. There was the count, and the count was the answer, and a civilization that has an unarguable answer to every question does not develop the habit of disagreement. And now the count had failed, twice, catastrophically, in front of everyone, and a people with no habit of disagreement had suddenly discovered that it had a great many things to disagree about, and no idea at all how to do it. Some of the keepers wanted to fight. They clung to the muster, to the 140,000 hulls, to the larger number, because the larger number was the only thought their civilization had ever taught them to think, and they thought it now with the desperate loudness of people who suspect they are wrong and cannot bear to find out. Some wanted to flee, to take the fastest hulls and run for the far borders, for the unowned dark beyond the concordance's edge, and start again somewhere the humans could not reach. And some, quietly, in ones and twos, in the corners of the yards where the readiness crews gathered, had begun to say the unsayable thing, that the war was already lost, that it had been lost at the 10th marker, and that the only question left was whether the keepers of the concordance would spend 140,000 more lives pretending otherwise. Terrace Vun heard all three arguments, and could not decide which of them he believed, and it was in that state of undecided misery that he witnessed the defection. It was a warden captain named HFY, a decorated officer of the Heartland Fleet, commander of a battle cruiser called the Ninth Certainty, and Terrace Vun knew him a little, enough to be shocked. HFY did not run for the far borders. He did something stranger and braver. He took the Ninth Certainty out of the muster, in full view of the yards, and he transmitted, on the open Heartland channels where every keeper could hear it, a message addressed not to the concordance, but to the human fleet that was 9 days away and closing. "To the cold armada," HFY said, and the whole muster heard it, and Terrace Vun stood frozen in the yard listening. "This is the warden cruiser Ninth Certainty. I have read the reports from Saul. I have read them the way an officer reads a report he does not want to believe twice, 3 times looking for the error, and there is no error. I have served the enumerated fleets for 9 sessions. I have never fired my guns in anger because the count always won before the firing began. And I have understood, reading your reports, a thing that my assembly cannot understand and will not let itself understand, and I am transmitting it in the open so that it is on the record before the muster kills me for it. The count was never the strength. We were never strong. We were only certain, and you have taken our certainty, and there is nothing underneath it, and I will not spend my crew's lives defending a certainty I no longer hold. I am standing the Ninth Certainty down. I am opening her to your inspection. Do with me what you judge right. But I will not fire on a people to preserve a lie, and I would rather be entered in your record as the first keeper who stopped than in ours as the last one who pretended. The muster yards erupted, exactly as the assembly had erupted, in the sound of 5,000 years refusing to end. There were calls for HFY's arrest, for the ninth certainty to be fired upon by the very fleet it had left, for the defector to be made an example. And Terrace Vun watched the calls come, and watched them go nowhere, because the thing about a civilization that has lost its one unarguable answer is that it can no longer command obedience, because obedience too had rested on the certainty, and the certainty was gone. No one fired on the ninth certainty. No one arrested HFY. The muster simply argued, loudly and pointlessly, while one cruiser sat with its guns cold and its bays open, and Terrace Vun understood, watching it, that HFY had done something the humans had not needed to do with a single shot. He had shown the Heartland that the muster could not even punish a defection, that the authority of the concordance had become a sound people made rather than a thing people obeyed. Later, much later, when it was all over, Terrace Vun would learn that the humans had received HFY's transmission, and that the young captain, Ira Van, had replied to it personally, and that her reply had been short. "Captain HFY," she had said, "keep your guns cold and your bays open and stay exactly where you are. You're the first. There'll be others now that you've shown them it's possible. That's how it always goes. The first one is the whole cost, and everyone after is free. You asked to be entered in our record. You're entered, not as a defector, as the first keeper who chose to stop being one. We'll remember the difference even if your assembly can't." And HFY had kept his guns cold, and there had been others, exactly as she said, not many. The concordance was too far gone in its certainty for many, but enough that when the cold armada finally arrived at Asuar, some fraction of the warden legions did not fire, sat instead with cold guns and open bays, and were spared, and lived and became, in the freed galaxy that followed, the small proof that even inside the arithmetic there had always been keepers who could choose otherwise. If only one of them was willing to be the first. But that was later. In the days before the arrival, Terrace Vun knew only that the Heartland was arguing with itself, and that the arguing was worse than any defeat, because it was the sound of a civilization discovering, far too late, that it had never learned how to be anything but certain. He went to Valoth, the old registrar, on the last night before the cold armada came, because Valoth was the only keeper he had ever known who seemed unsurprised by any of it, and he asked the old man the question that had been eating him since the muster yards. "Registrar," he said, "Captain HFY said we were never strong, that we were only certain. Is that true? 5,000 years, 911 worlds, was none of its strength?" Valoth was quiet a long moment. He was at the ledger, where he had spent most of his days since coming home, watching the crystalline archive glow with the accounting of 5,000 years, and he did not turn from it when he answered. "It was strength, Terrace," he said. "Do not let the young captain's cleverness convince you it was nothing. We built ships, real ships and yards and the science to make them, and we held a peace across a galaxy for 5,000 years, and a great many peoples lived under that peace who would otherwise have burned themselves to ash in their own small wars. That was real. That was strength." He was silent again. "But it was the strength of a wall, Terrace. And a wall is strong only against the thing it was built to stop, and we built our wall against comparison, against the day some enemy would count our hulls and count its own and understand it could not win. That wall was perfect. Nothing ever climbed it. And then a people came who did not compare, who did not count, who looked at our wall and did not ask how high it was, only whether they were willing to bring it down, and having decided they were, simply began. And a wall built against comparison is nothing at all against a people that has stopped comparing. So yes, we were strong, but we were strong the way a thing is strong that has only ever been tested by the test it was designed to pass. We never once faced a test we had not built ourselves. And the humans brought us a test we did not design, and we failed it in an afternoon, and the failing did not mean we had never been strong. It meant we had never once been strong at the thing that finally mattered. He turned at last to the young officer. Go home, Terrace. Do not be aboard a hull tomorrow. The muster is going to spend 140,000 lives proving a certainty it no longer holds, and I would not have you be one of them. Go home. Be alive when the book opens. The galaxy is going to need Sale, who were not aboard the last hulls of the arithmetic. Sale, who can help the freed worlds remember that we were not only the keepers, that some of us, at the end, chose to stop. Terrace Vun went home. He was alive when the book opened. And in the long, strange years after, when the freed worlds did the difficult work of deciding what to do with the Sale who had owned them, Terrace Vun was among those who stood between the two peoples, and did the patient work of reminding each of them that the other was not only the worst thing it had done, that there had been a Hesh Oran who stopped, and a Sale Andrew who told the truth, and a Neth Aldu who recorded it, and an old registrar who had warned the command they were about to learn a new word, and had been right, and had stayed at the ledger to the end to watch the arithmetic die where it had lived. The cold armada arrived at Asuar on the 9th day, and it did not arrive at the border. Terrace Vun was aboard the Warden flagship Perpetuity at the forward muster station in the near approaches when the human fleet emerged, and like every officer in the 140,000 hulls of the Heartland Defense, he had spent 9 days rehearsing the moment of contact, where the humans would appear, at which marker, at what range, how much warning the pickets would give. All of it was wasted. The cold armada did not appear at a marker. It appeared inside the Asuar approaches, threaded through the whole vast defensive sphere. The Warden legions had spent 9 days assembling, 200,000 cold-weathered hulls simply ceasing to be elsewhere and beginning to be here. All at once, in perfect distribution across the entire volume, the defense had meant a hold, as though the humans had studied the muster and placed one ship at the optimal killing position relative to every cluster of Warden hulls in the sphere, and then arrived at all those positions in the same instant. There was no line of battle. There was no approach to meet, no vector to concentrate against, no front. There was the Heartland defense, and then, between one breath and the next, there was the Heartland defense with the cold armada already inside it, everywhere at once. And Terrace Vun understood in that first instant that the 9 days of mustering had produced not a defense but a diagram, a careful map of exactly where 140,000 Sale had gathered themselves to die. Hold formation, the Warden Master ordered on the channel that bound the Heartland fleet, and it was the bravest and most useless order Terrace Vun ever heard because there was no formation left to hold. The humans were inside all of it. Concentrate fire. Bring them under the massed guns of the Warden legions. We defend the heart of the Concordance. We do not yield the Heartland. Fire. 140,000 hulls fired on the cold armada, and Terrace Vun, at his station aboard the Perpetuity, watched the accumulated fire of the largest fleet ever assembled in the Heartland cross the near dark and arrive upon the ugly weathered ships of the human fleet, and he watched them decline it, the way the Vanguard had watched, and the Vault had watched, and the Grand Enumeration had watched, and he understood that he was the newest witness to the oldest lesson of this war, and that the lesson had a body count, and that he was inside it. Then the human captain spoke, and she did not speak to the Heartland fleet. She spoke to the owned worlds. Her voice went out on every channel the Concordance had ever used to bind its holdings, the deep channels, the ones that reached the 911, and Terrace Vun heard it aboard the Perpetuity, and Veloth heard it at the ledger, and the delegates of the catalog civilizations heard it on 911 worlds, and the young captain's voice, when it came, was pitched not at the enemy she was defeating, but at the audience she had gathered, and Terrace Vun understood, hearing it, that the whole war had been building to this broadcast, that the battles had been the argument, and this was the verdict, spoken aloud so that no one ever could claim not to have heard it. "To every world in the ledger," said Captain Ira Van. "To the 911. You don't know us. You have no reason to trust us, and I'm not going to ask you to. I'm going to ask you to trust your own eyes instead, because you can all see right now, on the channels the Concordance built to own you, what is happening in the sky over Aswar. You can see the Heartland fleet firing on us. You can see that it isn't working. You can see the seat of the arithmetic, the place they kept the book that has your name in it, and you can see that we are already inside its defenses, and that there is nothing between us and the ledger but the last 100,000 hulls of a fleet that has never in its history had to actually fight. I want you to watch what happens next. I want every catalogued world to watch, because what happens next is for you. They told you it was a law of nature," she said. "They arrived at your border and they showed you the count, and they told you that submission was arithmetic, that resistance was subtraction, that the only rational choice was to kneel and be entered in the book. And you believed them because everyone believed them, because for 5,000 years no one ever proved otherwise. I'm not blaming you. The math was real. The hulls were real. When a thing that large tells you it is inevitable and you have never once seen it fail, you believe it and you sign, and you tell yourself it was a law. But it was never a law. It was a choice, theirs to threaten and yours to yield, and both of those choices could always have gone another way. We're proving that now over their heartland in front of all of you. And when we've finished, there is going to be a moment, you'll know it when it comes, when the thing that owned you simply stops. And in that moment, 911 worlds are going to discover that they were never actually held by a law. They were held by the belief that no one would ever refuse. That belief dies today. Watch it die. And then go home and be sovereign, because there was never anything stopping you but the count, and the count is over. The Warden legions died over the next 3 hours, and Terrace Vun survived it the way Neth Aldu had survived the Grand Enumeration and Sale Andrew had survived the 9th. Because the humans, methodical and unhurried, killing the fleet at whatever pace they chose, once again left witnesses, once again spared a fraction to carry the seeing. He watched the Perpetuity's sister ships wink out across his plot, cold white lines drawn through the Heartland defense, and he watched the massed fire of the Warden legions fall on the cold armada and do nothing. And he watched the number that had been the answer to everything for 5,000 years be revealed, one last time, as the courtesy it had always been. And when the Warden Master gave the order to hold formation for the 4th time, in the voice of a man reciting a prayer to a god he had watched die, Terrace Vun did not relay it. He sat at his station, and he watched the seat of the Concordance's power stand naked in the sky above the last 100,000 hulls of its defense, and he understood that he was watching the end of the only world he had ever known, and that the young human captain had been right about all of it, and that the not knowing was 5,000 years deep, and that there was no number large enough to buy it back. When the last of the Warden legions had been subtracted from the sky, the cold armada took station over Aswar, and it did not fire on the vault world. Valoth had expected the fire. He had stood at the ledger through the 3 hours of the Heartland fleets dying, watching the plot in the outer gallery, and he had prepared himself for the end he assumed was coming. The cold white lines reaching down through the atmosphere to draw their unmaking across the temple of the arithmetic, Aswar erased as Saul was to have been erased. The book and its keepers ended in a single stroke. It would have been just. It would have been arithmetic of a kind, the final subtraction. And it did not come. The 200,000 ships of the cold armada hung in the sky over the vault world, ugly and weathered and patient, and they did not fire. And Valoth understood slowly that the humans had never intended to burn Aswar, because burning Aswar would have been a thing done to the sail. And the humans had said, over and over, in the only grammar the Concordance could not misread, that their war was not with the sail. It was with the thing the sail had built. You could not burn the thing the sail had built. It was not made of hull or stone. It was made of a belief, held across 911 worlds. That force was a number and submission was a law. And you did not unmake a belief by drawing a line across it from orbit. You unmade it by being seen to refuse it, in the one place it lived most completely, in front of everyone who had ever knelt to it. So the humans came down. A single craft descended through the Aswar sky. Not a warship, not one of the ugly weathered hulls, but a small blunt vessel that broke through the high cloud layer of the vault world, trailing the daylight fire of atmospheric entry, lightning flickering around it in the storm its passage raised. And it came down through the temple district of Aswar, and settled in the great processional plaza beneath the assembly of the ledger. The plaza where 911 delegations had walked to sign away their sovereignty. And it opened, and the humans walked out onto the soil of the heartland. There were not many of them. That was the thing Veloth would remember, watching from the gallery above the plaza, that after 200,000 ships and 900,000 dead hulls and the unmaking of a star, the humans who walked onto the soil of Aswar to end the concordance numbered perhaps 40, and they walked without haste, unarmored in the plain hard clothing of a working fleet, and at their head walked a young female of the species, and Veloth knew, before the translation cohort confirmed it, that this was the voice from the 10th marker, the voice that had spoken to Otten Sur and Sale Andrew and the first speaker and the 911, Captain Ira Van. She was young. She was younger than he had let himself imagine, younger than any speaker, younger than most of the officers who had died in the sky above her, and she walked across the plaza where the whole galaxy had been taught to kneel, and she did not look up at the guns of the vault world, and she did not look back at her ships, and she walked as though the ground she crossed had always been going to be crossed by her, at exactly this hour, in exactly this way. The assembly of the ledger convened to meet her, because there was nothing else left to do. The speakers gathered in the great tiered chamber beneath the crystalline archive, and the humans were admitted, 40 of them, walking into the seat of the arithmetic, beneath the glowing book that held the accounting of 911 ownerships. And Veloth, who had made his small, disobedient decision to be present at the end, stood at the edge of the speaking floor and watched the young captain look up at the ledger for the first time. She looked at it a long moment. The whole chamber watched her look. The ledger hung at the heart of the hall, vast and cold and radiant, 5,000 years of ownership rendered in crystal and light, the most complete record of submission ever assembled, and the young human captain looked up at it with an expression Veloth could not read at first, and then could, and it was not hatred, and it was not triumph. It was something closer to grief. "So this is it," Captain Ira Van said. Her voice in the chamber was quieter than it had been on the channels, and the translation cohort carried it to every speaker in the tiers. "This is the book." She was silent a moment. 911 worlds. Every one of them a people who wanted to live, who looked at your arithmetic and made the only choice you left them, and you wrote their names in here and called it peace. She lowered her eyes from the ledger to the tiers of speakers. "I'm not going to give a speech. You've heard everything I have to say. I said it in the sky, and I said it at Saul, and I said it at the 10th marker to an officer who's since learned I was right about all of it. So I'll just tell you what happens now, plainly, so it can be entered accurately, one last time, into the book that's about to stop being a book." "You will not touch the ledger," said a speaker from the high tiers, and his voice shook. "It is the record of 5,000 years. It is the memory of the concordance. Whatever you do to us, the book is." "The book," said Captain Van, "is a list of crimes that call themselves laws, and I'm not going to destroy it. That's the part you're bracing for, and it isn't coming. If I burned the ledger in 10,000 years, your descendants would tell each other it had held something noble, something the barbarians from Earth were too small to understand, and the story would grow back, and some new frightened empire would read it and think the arithmetic had only failed because it wasn't applied firmly enough. No. I'm not going to destroy your book." She turned slowly, taking in the whole chamber, the tiers, the speakers, the keepers, the crystalline archive glowing above them all. "I'm going to open it, every entry, every world. I'm going to take the accounting you kept in secret, the The true record, not the peace you told each other, but the threats you made and the wealth you took and the choices you erased. And I'm going to give it to the 911. All of it. Every catalogued world is going to receive its own entry, in your own hand, in the concordance's own record, so that no one ever has to take our word for what was done to them. They can read it themselves. And then they're going to decide, each of them sovereign for the first time in 5,000 years, what to do with the truth. That's the unmaking of the concordance speaker, not fire, sunlight. I'm going to open the book you spent everything to keep closed, and let 911 peoples read what you wrote about them, and there is no fleet in the galaxy that can defend you from that. Veloth, at the edge of the speaking floor, understood then what the humans had come to do, and understood that it was worse than burning and better than mercy, and understood that it was, precisely, arithmetic turned inside out. The concordance had spent 5,000 years accumulating a secret ledger of what it had taken, believing the record its private strength, and the humans were about to make the record public, and in the making public the strength would become the indictment, entry by entry, world by world. The book that had owned the galaxy would become the confession that freed it. The assembly forbids it, the High Speaker said, and it was the last time in the history of the concordance that the assembly of the ledger forbade anything, and everyone in the chamber heard how small the words had become. The assembly, said Captain Eira Van, doesn't have a fleet anymore. She looked up at the ledger one final time. Open it, she said to the humans behind her, and the humans behind her, who had spent the crossing preparing for exactly this, moved to the archive and began, quietly, methodically, without any drama at all, to do the thing the whole final war had been for. The opening of the ledger took 11 hours, and Veloth stayed for all of it. He stayed because he had made his one disobedient decision and meant to see it through, and he stayed because he was a registrar, a keeper of records, and there was something in him that needed to witness the record being turned against the thing that kept it. The humans worked without ceremony. They did not gloat over the archive or make speeches to it. A handful of them stood at the interface stations beneath the crystalline ledger, working with the quiet competence of people performing a task they had rehearsed 100 times, and one by one the entries opened not to the chamber, but outward, along the deep channels, to the worlds each entry named. The concordance had built those channels to bind its holdings. The humans used them to unbind them. 911 times, an entry that had been sealed in the private ledger of the arithmetic for as long as 5,000 years, and as little as a season unsealed and traveled home to the world it accounted, carrying with it the true record, the survey that had judged the world worth taking, the threat that had been made, the wealth that had been assessed and extracted, the sovereignty that had been catalogued and filed, all of it in the concordance's own cold hand, undeniable, unspinnable. The confession and the crime in the same document. Veloth watched the first entries land, on the plot in the chamber, and he watched the responses begin to come back, and the responses were the sound of the concordance ending. They did not come back as fleets or as fire. The owned worlds had no fleets. That had been the whole point. They came back as something the arithmetic had never learned to measure and had no column for. They came back as refusal. World after world, reading its own entry, understanding for the first time in the plain language of the record that its submission had never been a law but a robbery, simply stopped. Stopped remitting the tributes the session had assessed. Stopped answering the concordance's binding channels except to transmit. Back up the line toward Asuar, their own entries, read aloud in their own voices, so that the heartland would hear its crimes recited to it in 911 languages at once. Stopped in a matter of hours being owned, not because anyone had freed them, but because the belief that had held them, the belief that no one would ever refuse, had been the only thing holding them, and it was gone, and a thing held up by a belief falls the instant the belief does. You see, said Captain Eira Van quietly, standing beneath the ledger with Veloth at her side, for she had come to stand beside the old registrar at some point in the 11 hours, having marked him, perhaps, as the one keeper in the chamber who was watching rather than mourning. It was never the fleet that held them. The fleet was just the argument for the belief. Kill the belief and the fleet was never necessary. You could have held this whole galaxy with a single ship and a good enough story, as long as nobody ever checked whether the story was true. She looked up at the archive, at the entries emptying out of it into the sovereign dark. That's what we took from you, not your ships. We took the story. And you're never getting it back because it's not the kind of thing that can be taken twice. Once a galaxy has watched someone refuse the arithmetic and win, the arithmetic stops working forever. That's the whole meaning of a final war, Registrar. It's the one you fight so that the fight never has to happen again. Veloth found that he could speak. You could have simply ruled us, he said. You have the fleet, you have the heartland. You could have taken the ledger and written your own name at the top of it and owned the 911 yourselves. Why the sunlight? Why give them the truth and walk away? You could have had everything the Concordance had. The young captain looked at him, and for a moment the coldness that had carried her through the whole war lifted, and Veloth saw underneath it something very tired and very human and very young. Because we've read our own history, Registrar, she said. The whole of it, all the way down to the bottom, the way we had to read everything. And every single time a people took the seat at the top of the book, every single time, no matter how good their reasons, no matter how sure they were that they'd be the ones to hold it justly, the book won. It always wins. It's built to. Sit in that chair and in 100 years you're doing arithmetic too, telling some smaller people that force is a number and resistance is subtraction, and you don't even notice it happening because the chair does it to you. So we're not going to sit in the chair. We're going to burn the chair, not the book, the chair, the seat, the whole idea that there's a place at the top of the galaxy for someone to own it from. And then we're going to go home. That's the part you won't believe until you've watched us do it. We came all this way, we broke the greatest power in the galaxy, we stood in its temple with its book in our hands and we're going to open the book, free the worlds and leave. No tribute, no garrison, no entry with our name on it. Because the only way to win the final war is to make sure that, when it's over, there's no throne left standing for the next empire to climb into, including us. And the humans did exactly that. It took 9 days to open all of the ledger, and in those 9 days the Concordance dissolved, not in fire, not in slaughter, but in the simple withdrawal of the belief that had been its only real substance. The Warden legions were gone. The grand enumeration was gone. The enumerated fleets that had bound the galaxy for 5,000 years existed now only as the 11,000 survivors the humans had deliberately spared to carry the news. And those 11,000, arriving home to a heartland that no longer commanded anything, did not know whom to obey, because obedience too had been a belief, and the belief was over. The assembly of the ledger convened for the last time on the 4th day, and could not agree on a single order that anyone would follow, and dissolved, and did not reconvene. The speakers who had ratified 911 absorptions found themselves, within a week, with nothing to speak for. Vorad Kel, the first speaker of the enumerated fleets, was brought home to Ossuar on the 7th day, retrieved from the drifting wreck of the ossuary of days where he had sat hollow since Saul, and the humans did to him the one thing they had promised and the one thing he could not survive. They did not kill him. They gave him his own entries to read. Every session he had ratified, every threat he had authorized, every world he had counted and taken in his own cold hand, unsealed and made public, and recited back to him in the voices of the peoples he had catalogued. And Vorad Kel, who had built his whole self on the certainty that force was a law and submission a mathematics, and that therefore he had done nothing but apply the inevitable, was made to sit and read, in the Concordance's own record, the proof that it had always been a choice. That he had chosen 911 times. And there is no fleet and no armor and no final column that defends a man from his own record when it is finally read aloud. and Vorodkel did not last long after that, not because anyone harmed him, but because there had never been anything of him behind the arithmetic, and with the arithmetic proven a crime, there was nothing left to hold the shape of a first speaker, and he simply, quietly stopped. Sale Andrew lived. The disgraced legionary master who had come to the heartland to be shamed a second time was, in the strange justice of the war's end, the one senior officer of the Concordance who had told the truth before the truth arrived, and the freed worlds remembered it. When the peoples of the former ledger began, in the months after, the long, difficult work of deciding what to do with the keepers who had owned them, Sale Andrew was among the very few the record spoke for rather than against. The man who had lost a legion to one ship and reported, honestly, that the fault was in the book and not in himself, and been struck from command for saying so. He spent the rest of his life traveling the freed worlds, not as a ruler and not as a penitent exactly, but as a witness, telling the story of the 10th marker and the young captain's voice and the arithmetic that had been a lie, so that no one would forget how it had happened, or how nearly it had never happened at all. And Neth Aldu, the signal keeper who had turned her recorder from the battle to the first speaker in the ruin of the grand enumeration, Neth Aldu became the first Sale to stand before the assembled delegates of the 911 freed worlds and testify, not to defend the Concordance, there was no defending it, to account for it, to do the thing the young captain had demanded of Vorodkel and Vorodkel could not do, to stand in front of the peoples her people had catalogued and say, out loud, this was done, and it was done by choice, and it called itself a law so that we would not have to feel it, and I recorded it, and here is the record. She was young, and she had believed the arithmetic once, on the 11th day before the grand enumeration sailed, and she had watched it die in the space of a breath, and she spent the rest of her long life making certain the galaxy remembered both the belief and the dying, so that the next time some frightened and overwhelming power arrived at a smaller people's border with a count in its hand and a law in its mouth, there would be a word for what it was, and the word would not be inevitable. The cold armada left Asuar on the 9th day, when the last entry had been opened, and it did not leave a garrison behind, and it did not leave a governor, and it did not leave so much as a single ugly, weathered hull to remind the heartland who had come. It simply finished the work it had come to do, the freeing of the book, the ending of the chair, and then it turned, 200,000 cold hulls, and went home, back down the long road past the 4th marker and the 10th, past the drifting wrecks of the 9th Legion and the grand enumeration, back to the small yellow star at the heart of a system that a survey had once counted at 4,000 hulls, and it did not boast, and it did not linger. And within a season, the sky over Asuar held nothing at all but the ordinary stars. Veloth stood at the ledger long after the humans had gone, and he watched the crystalline archive glow with the last of its light, emptied now, every entry opened, every world reading its own robbery home, and he understood that he was standing in the ruin of the thing he had served his whole life, and that the ruin had been just, and that being right about it all those weeks ago at Asuar 9 had bought him exactly nothing except the burden of having seen it coming. He had promised the command they were about to learn a new word. He knew the word now. It was not a word for the human fleet, or the human guns, or the impossible ships that fire could not touch. Those had only ever been the grammar. The word was smaller and older, and it belonged to the humans themselves, the thing they had carried across a galaxy and left in the wreckage of the arithmetic. And Veloth, an old registrar at the end of a long and obedient life, entered it at last into his own private accounting, the only entry that had ever mattered. The word was refusal. The galaxy learned humanity's name in that season, and it did not learn it the way the Concordance had feared, not as a new arithmetic, a new count, a new power arriving to take the empty chair. It learned it as the answer to a question no one had known could be asked. For 5,000 years the owned worlds had believed that when an overwhelming force stands over you and orders you to kneel, The only choices are to die or to submit, and that the wise chose submission, and that this was a law. The humans had proven it was not a law. They had proven that there was a third thing older than either, that a people could reach for when the strong arrived with a count in their hands, and that the third thing was not survival, and was not victory, but was simply the refusal itself, made total, made final, made without any condition of ending except the ending of the thing that came to make them kneel. The humans called it a final war. The galaxy, in the years that followed, came to call it by their name. And that was the whole of the lesson, and the reason it never had to be taught twice. Long after the Cold Armada had gone home, long after Aswar had become just another world and the ledger just another ruin, the story stayed, on 911 freed worlds and in 1,000 tongues, and its shape never changed in the telling. An overwhelming empire ordered a single system to surrender. The system laughed. And when the empire sent its arithmetic to collect 11,000 hulls, then 900,000, then the unmaking of a star, the system met all of it with 200,000 ugly weathered ships and a young captain's flat cold voice, and it did not lose one of them, and it did not stop, because it had never intended to stop, because it had told the accountants at the very beginning, in the only sentence that had ever mattered. To us, dying and submitting have always been the same word, and we decline them both. They ordered humanity to surrender. Humanity laughed. And then, patiently, methodically, with 200,000 hulls that fire could not touch, and a lesson 10,000 years in the making, humanity taught the galaxy the one thing the arithmetic had spent 5,000 years ensuring no one would ever learn, that the count had always been a courtesy, that the strength had always been a story, and that the only force that had ever truly existed belonged to whoever was willing to make it a final war, and mean it, all the way down to the bottom, where the humans had been standing the entire time.